The flickering fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting jagged shadows across the scuffed tiles of the Eastbridge Police Department. The air was thick with the stale scent of burnt coffee and the low murmur of clipped conversations, punctuated now and then by the harsh bark of a sergeant's command slicing through the hum. Officers milled about with a practiced air of indifferences hunched over desks, shuffling papers with mechanical disinterest, while others lounged against the walls, their slouched postures a quiet rebellion against the rigid hierarchy they all understood too well. This wasn't a gleaming bastion of justice, it was a gritty arena, a place where power was currency and everyone instinctively knew their rank in the unspoken order. Samantha Carter Sam, as she pre-Fred pushed through the glass doors, her heels striking the floor with a crisp, deliberate rhythm that seemed to echo her resolve. She wore a sharply pressed blazer, its clean lines a stark contrast to the worn surroundings, and her hair was swept back into a tight, no-nonsense bun that spoke of discipline and purpose. The moment she stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted, hitting her like a wave of humid disdain. She felt the weight of their stereoscopic glances that lingered too long, raised eyebrows that carried silent questions, and the faint curl of lips that hinted at judgment. It wasn't new to her. She'd faced it in courtrooms packed with skeptical faces, at the academy where her every move was dissected, and in countless rooms where her very existence felt like a disruption. But here, it was raw, almost physical, a wall of hostility she could nearly reach out and touch. The lobby grew quieter as she crossed it, the hum of chatter fading into hushed murmurs and barely concealed whispers. "Who's that?" one officer muttered, his voice low but sharp, cutting through the stillness. "New brass, probably," another replied, his smirk dripping with skepticism, as if her presence alone was a punchline to some private joke. Sam kept her gaze steady, her posture unyielding, her steps purposeful. She wasn't here to win their affection or beg for acceptance. She had a mission, a duty, and she intended to see it through, no matter the resistance. "Hold it right there," a voice barked, slicing through the muted buzz like a blade. Sam turned, her expression calm but alert, to find a tall, broad-shouldered officer striding toward her. His shaved head gleamed under the flickering lights, and a cocky grin stretched across his face as he gripped a baton in one hand and a steaming mug of coffee in the other. His badge caught the light, flashing his name, Officer Jake Daniels. He stopped a few feet away, his stance radiating a mix of authority and menace, his eyes narrowing as he sized her up. "You lost?" he asked, his tone thick with condescension, the kind of casual dominance meant to put someone in their place. "No," Sam replied, her voice even, unshaken. "I'm here for work." Daniels let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head as if she'd told a bad joke. "Work? What are YOUR? Legal, maybe, because you sure don't look like you belong out here." His words drew a snicker from a couple of officers nearby, their laughter a quiet echo of his disdain. Sam felt the heat of their attention prickling her skin, but she refused to flinch. She stood taller, her chin lifting slightly. "I'm Lieutenant Carter," she said, her tone firm, cutting through the air like a whip. "And I'm here to see Captain Ramirez." The laughter died instantly. Daniel's smirk faltered, though he tried to mask the flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Lieutenant, huh?" he said, tapping his baton against his palm with a slow, deliberate rhythm. "Funny, you don't look the part." His voice carried a challenge, daring her to prove herself. Sam didn't blink. "And you don't look like someone who knows how to follow protocol," she shot back, her words steady and sharp. Yet here we are. The room fell silent, the air growing heavy with tension. Daniel's smirk vanished, replaced by a cold, hardened glare. He took a step closer, encroaching on her space, his presence looming. "You've got a lot of nerve walking in here like you own the place," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "Let me give you some advice. Round here, respect isn't given, it's earned." Sam met his stare without wavering, her dark eyes locking onto his. "Then you'd better start earning mine," she replied, her voice a quiet steel that cut deeper than any shout. The silence stretched taut, a thread ready to snap. Daniel's grip tightened on his baton, his knuckles whitening, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed he might cross a line. He raised the weapon slightly subtle, menacing gesture meant to intimidate, but in his haste to assert control, his fingers slipped. The baton clattered to the floor with a hollow, embarrassing thud, the sound reverberating through the room. A few onlookers stifled snickers, their amusement barely concealed. Daniel's face flushed a deep crimson, his jaw clenching as he stooped to retrieve it, his movements stiff with humiliated fury. Sam didn't move, her expression impassive, though her eyes held his with an unspoken challenge. Before the standoff could escalate further, a calm but commanding voice broke through. "Lieutenant Carter." Both Sam and Daniels turned to see Captain Ramirez standing in the doorway of his office, his arms crossed over his chest, his sharp gaze flicking between them. His presence was steady, authoritative, an anchor in the storm of tension. "That's enough," he said to Daniels, his tone leaving no room for debate. Daniels stepped back, reluctance etched into every line of his body, the baton now gripped tightly in his hand. "Just making sure the lieutenant understands how things work around here," he muttered, his voice laced with defiance. "She understands just fine," Ramirez replied, his words edged with a warning. "Now get back to work." Daniels shot Sam one last glare, his boots thudding heavily against the tile as he stormed off. The room slowly stirred back to life, though the undercurrent of unease lingered like smoke. Ramirez gestured toward Sam with a curt nod. "My office," he said, turning and disappearing down the hallway. As Sam followed, she felt every pair of eyes tracking her, their weight pressing against her back. She didn't let it show. Her face remained a mask of composure, but inside, her heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't just a new assignment, it was a proving ground, a gauntlet thrown at her feet. The first skirmish had already begun, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. Samantha Carter had spent her life clawing her way to every table she sat at. Raised in a modest neighborhood where opportunity was a rare guest, she'd learned young that nothing would come easy. Her childhood home was a small, weathered house on a street lined with cracked sidewalks and faded dreams, where the sound of sirens was more familiar than birdsong. Scholarships had been her lifeline, earned through sleepless nights hunched over textbooks, her fingers stained with ink and her mind burning with determination. Law school had tested her limits, the police academy had pushed her harder still, but she'd thrived in those crucible moment spaces where her presence was a question mark, where whispers of "she doesn't belong" trailed her like shadows. At Eastbridge, though, those whispers weren't quiet. They were bold, pointed, sometimes spat directly in her face. "Quota higher," the words sliced through the air, sharp and deliberate. Sam's head snapped toward the sound, her jaw tightening as she spotted Jake Daniels leaning against a desk across the room. His arms were crossed, his smirk a weapon of pure confidence laced with contempt. Beside him stood Officer Harris, younger and leaner, his chuckle a nervous echo of Daniels' bravado. Harris shifted his weight, his eyes darting between his partner and Sam, caught between amusement and uncertainty. Sam squared her shoulders, her steps measured as she walked past them, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. But the words hung there, heavy and sour, a stench she couldn't shake. It wasn't the first time she'd heard it, but the sting was fresh every time, a needle pricking at the armor she'd spent years forging. As she reached her desk, Harris' voice carried again, loud enough to ensure she heard. "Guess we're hiring anyone these days." Sam froze, her fingers curling around the edges of the case file in her hands, the paper crinkling under her grip. Slowly, she turned, her gaze piercing. "Do you have something to say to me, Officer Harris?" Her voice was sharp, controlled, a blade wrapped in velvet. Harris shrugged, feigning innocence, though his smirk betrayed him. "Just making an observation." "Ma'am," Daniels snorted, a sound thick with derision, and Sam's eyes shifted to him. "It's funny," she said, her tone deceptively calm. "You spend so much time observing me. I'm starting to think you don't have enough real work to do." Daniel's smirk faded, his glare hardening into something colder, more dangerous. Harris faltered, glancing at his partner for backup, but Sam didn't wait for a retort. She turned back to her desk, her heels clicking against the tile like a metronome marking her resolve. The encounter left a bitter taste, but she swallowed it down. She'd faced worse, if far worse, and she wouldn't let their petty jabs derail her. Later that day, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Casting long shadows across the precinct parking lot, Sam headed to her car. Her mind churned with the day's events, the sit-along glances, the muttered slights, the palpable resistance that went beyond mere dislike. It felt orchestrated, a quiet campaign to test her limits. "Lieutenant Carter," the voice stopped her mid-step, and she turned to see Harris leaning against a patrol car. His posture casual, but his expression smug, teetering on confrontational. "Got a minute?" he asked, though it wasn't a question. Sam crossed her arms, her patience thinning. "What do you want, Harris?" He pushed off the car, sauntering toward her with a lazy stride that belied the tension in his eyes. "Just curious," he said, closing the distance. "What's it like getting handed everything on a silver platter? Must be nice, not having to work for it." Her jaw tightened, a muscle twitching as she fought to keep her composure. "You think I haven't worked for this?" she asked, her voice low but laced with steel. Harris stepped closer, undeterred. "I think you're here because someone upstairs wanted to check a box. Diversity, right? Gotta make the department look good." His words were a taunt, each syllable dripping with accusation. Sam didn't flinch, though her pulse quickened. She took a step forward, closing the gap between them, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "I've worked twice as hard as anyone here to get where I am," she said, her eyes boring into his. "So if you've got a problem with that, maybe you should ask yourself why you're so threatened by me." Harris opened his mouth, caught off guard by her intensity, but before he could respond, Daniel's voice cut through the evening air. "Harris," he called from across the lot, his tone impatient. "You coming or what?" Harris hesitated, his gaze flicking between Daniel's and Sam, then stepped back with a dismissive shrug. "See you round, Lieutenant," he muttered, turning away. Sam watched him go, her heart pounding against her ribs, the adrenaline surging through her veins. The tension was a living thing now, coiling tighter with every passing hour, and she knew it wouldn't dissipate easily. This was more than personal, it was systemic, a festering wound in the department's core. By the next morning, the hostility had metastasized. Whispers followed her through the hallways like a persistent shadow. Sit-along stairs tracked her every move, and small but deliberate obstacles began to pile up. Files she requested vanished from the system, emails went unanswered, and every exchange with Daniels or Harris crackled with veiled insults or outright defiance. As she made her way to the evidence room, she caught sight of the two officers huddled near the break room, their voices low and conspiratorial. They fell silent as she approached, their faces unreadable but unmistakably pointed. "Morning," Sam said coolly, her tone a deliberate challenge as she passed them without slowing. "Lieutenant," Daniels replied, his voice thick with mock politeness, a sneer tugging at the corner of his mouth. Sam's grip tightened on her clipboard, her knuckles whitening, but she kept moving. Inside the evidence room, she attacked the stack of case files with a focus that bordered on ferocious, her fingers flipping through pages with precision. If they thought they could shake her, they were gravely mistaken. She'd faced worse than their juvenile game-show-style professors who'd doubted her intellect, classmates who'd mocked her ambition, a world that had tried to box her in at every turn. This was nothing new, but the undercurrent here was darker, more insidious, and it gnawed at her resolve. Harris lingered in her mind, to not just his words, but the flicker of uncertainty she'd seen in his eyes. He wasn't as hardened as Daniels, not yet. There was a nervousness to him, a crack in his bravado that suggested he might still be swayed, or at least unsettled. Daniels, though, was a different beast, arrogant, unyielding, a man who wielded his authority like a blunt instrument. Together, they were a volatile pair, and Sam knew they'd push harder before this was over. As she sifted through the files, her thoughts drifted to the bigger picture. This wasn't just about Harris, it was about what she represented, a challenge to a system that thrived on exclusion. Justice, she'd always believed, was a light worth chasing, but here it felt dimmed, distorted by prejudice and unchecked power. Daniels and Harris weren't outliers, they were symptoms, products of a culture that rewarded dominance over accountability. And yet, Sam couldn't shake the lesson that pulsed beneath it all. Power, when abused, carried consequences. Daniels didn't know it yet, but his baton wasn't just a tool, it was a tether, tying him to a reckoning he couldn't escape. For Sam, the fight wasn't just about survival, it was about exposing that truth. dragging it into the open where it couldn't be ignored. The war had only begun, and she was ready to see it through. Samantha Carter stood alone in the precinct's cluttered file room, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against the edges of a worn manila folder. The air was thick with the musty scent of old paper and the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. She'd been at this for hours, piecing together fragments of a puzzle no one else seemed eager to solve. The door behind her groaned on its hinges, a slow, deliberate sound that made her shoulders tense. She turned, her breath catching as she saw Ramirez framed in the doorway, his face shadowed and unreadable, like a storm cloud rolling in over an already gray sky. "Got a minute?" His voice was low, gravelly, carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too much and said too little. Sam nodded, though her stomach twisted with unease. She followed him down the hall, her boots clicking against the scuffed linoleum, the sound echoing in the quiet corridor. Ramirez's office was a small, dimly lit sanctuary of chaos. Stacks of papers teetered on his desk. A flickering desk lamp cast jagged shadows across the walls, and the faint smell of stale coffee lingered in the air. He shut the door behind her with a soft click, then leaned against the edge of his desk, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His posture was casual, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something deeper: worry, perhaps, or resignation. "You've kicked up a hell of a mess," he said, skipping any pleasantries. His words hung heavy between them, sharp and pointed. Sam arched an eyebrow, her heart thudding a little faster. "Because I'm doing my job?" she asked, her tone steady but laced with a quiet challenge. Ramirez shook his head, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Because you're new. Because this place doesn't take kindly to strangers waltzing in and shaking things up. You start poking around, asking questions, stepping on toast iron, not going to roll out the welcome mat. They'll shove back twice as hard." Sam held his gaze, unflinching, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her, but she refused to bend. "And you're saying I should just back off?" she asked, her voice cool but firm. Ramirez hesitated, his eyes searching hers for a long moment. The silence stretched taut, like a wire about to snap. "No," he said finally, his tone softening just enough to hint at something like respect. "I'm saying you need to play it smart. You're not going to win anyone over by locking horns with Daniels or Harris. They've been here forever, got roots deep in this place, alliances you can't even see yet." Sam crossed her arms, mirroring his stance, her jaw tightening as she weighed his warning. "Then I'll dig my own roots," she replied, her voice steady as steel. Ramirez studied her, his dark eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to gauge how far her resolve would carry her. After a beat, he let out a heavy sigh, the sound rough and weary. "Just watch your step, Carter. This precinct, it's got teeth. It chews people up and spits them out before they even realize they're bleeding." She left his office with his words echoing in her mind, a grim melody she couldn't shake. But instead of fear, a spark of determination flared brighter inside her. The hostility she'd faced since day one wasn't just about her being the new face. In a tight-knit crew, it ran deeper, a festering rot woven into the very fabric of this place. Complacency had taken root here, nourished by corruption, and she'd be damned if she let it choke out the truth. Justice wasn't a luxury she could afford to compromise on, no matter how many walls she had to tear down to find it. The morning had started with a brittle tension, like the air before a storm breaks. By noon, that tension had erupted into something raw and jagged. Sam sat at a battered table in the precinct's common area, surrounded by the low hum of voices and the rustle of paperwork. Case files were spread out before her, their contents a tangle of inconsistencies she couldn't ignore, with no clear cause, evidence logs that didn't add up, complaints that vanished like smoke. She was lost in her thoughts, her pen scratching notes in the margins when a shadow fell across the table. Daniels sauntered in, his movements slow and deliberate, like a hunter stalking through tall grass. His uniform was crisp, his posture relaxed, but his eyes locked onto her with the cold precision of a predator sizing up its next meal. "Lieutenant Carter," he drawled, his voice dripping with a mockery so thick it made her skin crawl. "Hard at work, I see." Sam didn't look up, her fingers tightening around her pen as she forced her focus to stay on the file. "What do you need, Daniels?" she asked, Her tone clipped, a warning woven into the words. Need, he chuckled, a low, grating sound, and leaned against a nearby desk, his baton tapping rhythmically against the wood. The sound was maddening, a taunt disguised as idleness. Nothing, just wondering how you're settling in. Fitting in okay? She flicked her eyes up to meet his, her patience fraying at the edges. I didn't ask for your interest, she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through his feigned civility. His grin widened, unfazed, a flash of teeth that didn't reach his eyes. Not interest, just checking in. Wouldn't want you feeling out of place. Sam snapped the file shut with a decisive thud, rising to her feet to face him fully. The room seemed to shrink as their gazes locked, the air crackling with unspoken hostility. Let's skip the games, Daniels, she said, her voice low and steady. Say what you came to say. His grin faded, replaced by a hard, calculating stare that stripped away any pretense. The point, Carter, is this isn't some playground where you can stroll in and start barking orders. Respect around here, you earn it, and all you've done so far is piss people off. She stepped closer, closing the distance between them, her heart pounding but her expression unyielding. Respect doesn't come from flexing muscle or throwing threats around. And if you think I'm going to shrink back because you and your crew don't like me sniffing around, you've got a rude awakening coming. The tension in the room thickened, a palpable weight that pressed against her chest. Nearby officers paused mid-task, their eyes darting between amusement and unease, but none dared to intervene. Daniels straightened, his hand tightening around his baton until his knuckles whitened. Careful, Carter, he said, his voice a low growl. You're dancing on a razor's edge. Her gaze flicked to the baton for a heartbeat, then back to his face unflinching. Is that a threat, Officer Daniels? He didn't answer with words. Instead, he stepped into her space, close enough that she could smell the faint tang of his sweat, his presence a deliberate invasion. Before she could react, his hand shot out, clamping down on her arm with a grip meant to dominate, to remind her who held the power here. The room fell silent, a suffocating stillness broken only by the thud of her own pulse in her ears. Sam didn't flinch, didn't pull away it yet. She met his stare, her eyes burning with a fury she kept tightly leashed. Take your hand off me, she said, her voice a blade of ice, each word deliberate and unyielding. For a moment, he didn't move, his fingers digging in harder, testing her limits. Then, as if sensing the weight of every eye now fixed on them, he released her, stepping back with a smirk that barely masked his frustration. Watch yourself, he muttered, his voice a hushed threat meant for her alone. You don't want me as your enemy. Sam took a step back, raising her voice just enough to carry across the room. Touch me again, Daniels, and I'll make sure the only thing you're holding is a pink slip. A ripple of murmurs spread through the onlookers and turned away, suddenly engrossed in their work, while others exchanged sly, entertained glances. No one spoke up, no one moved to intervene. Daniel's jaw clenched, his composure cracking for a fleeting second before he forced that smirk back into place. Big talk, Lieutenant. Let's see if you've got the guts to back it up. With that, he turned and strode out, his heavy footsteps reverberating against the tile like a drumbeat of defiance. The confrontation didn't fade quietly into the background. By afternoon, the precinct buzzed with whispers, a current of gossip that crackled through every hallway and cubicle. Sam felt the weight of every sidelong glance, heard the hushed tones that followed her like a shadow. The lines where drawn Daniels had the loyalty of half the department, and they weren't shy about showing it. At one point, Harris sidled up to her near the coffee station, a chipped mug dangling from his hand and a sly grin plastered across his face. You've got a real knack for making waves, Carter, he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Sam didn't glance at him as she poured her coffee, the dark liquid steaming as it hit the cup. Something you want to say, Harris? She asked, her tone flat but edged with steel. He chuckled, leaning against the counter with a casualness that didn't match the glint in his eyes. Just curious how long you think you'll hold up. Daniels, he's not the type you want to tangle with. She turned to face him, her expression a mask of calm that hid the fire simmering beneath. Daniels doesn't scare me, but anyone propping him up, that's a different story. Harris' grin faltered for a split second, but he shrugged it off, sauntering away with a breezy, good luck, Lieutenant. You're gonna need it. By the end of the day, Sam found herself summoned back to Ramirez's office. The door creaked as she stepped inside, closing it behind her with a firm thud. Ramirez sat behind his desk, his face a blank slate, though the tightness around his eyes hinted at the storm brewing within. A stack of untouched reports sat in front of him, a silent testament to the chaos she'd stirred. "Sit," he said, his voice clipped, not looking up from the desk. She obeyed, folding her hands in her lap, her spine straight as she waited for him to break the silence. "I've been hearing things," he began, his tone carefully neutral, though she could sense the undercurrent of frustration, about what went down in the common area. Sam didn't waver, her voice steady as she replied. "Daniels put his hands on me. I told him to back off." Ramirez sighed, leaning back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. "Carter, you've been here less than a week, and you're already turning this place into a war zone. With all due respect, Captain, I didn't start this, Nils did." His eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation breaking through his calm. "And you couldn't have handled it quieter, dialed it down instead of lighting a match?" Sam leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not here to be manhandled, Captain, not by him, not by anyone, especially not in front of the whole precinct." For a long moment, Ramirez said nothing. His fingers steepled as he studied her, the silence heavy with unspoken tension. Finally, he exhaled sharply, the sound cutting through the stillness. "Daniels has been here a long time. He's got people in his corner more than you realize. You need to pick your fights wisely." "Understood." Sam nodded, though the defiance in her eyes didn't fade. "Understood," she said, her voice firm. Ramirez shook his head, a faint trace of exhaustion creeping into his expression. "Just be careful, Carter. You're not winning any friends here." As she stepped out of his office, she knew he meant well, but his caution felt like a misstep. She wasn't here to win a popularity contest, was here to drag the truth into the light, to hold a mirror up to a system that thrived on protecting its own, no matter how rotten the core. Justice wasn't a negotiation, and the consequences of power unchecked were a lesson this precinct would learn. One way or another, the next time she entered Ramirez's office, the air felt differentiker. Charged with something unspoken, she closed the door behind her, the sound a quiet punctuation in the stillness. Ramirez sat behind his desk, his fingers laced together, his face a mask of restraint, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of weariness. The stack of reports in front of him hadn't moved, a silent witness to the growing storm. "Sit down," he said, his voice flat, his gaze fixed on the desk. Sam settled into the chair, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her posture rigid as she braced for what was coming. "We need to talk about Daniels," he said, his words heavy, sinking into the room like stones into deep water. "I figured," Sam replied, her tone even but laced with an edge of resolve. Ramirez leaned forward, bracing his elbows on the desk, his eyes finally meeting hers. "Carter, you've been here a handful of days, and you've already got enough friction going to spark a fire that'll burn this place down. Do you even realize the kind of fallout this could bring?" Her jaw tightened, a flare of indignation rising in her chest. "With respect, Captain, Daniels is the one who lit the fuse. I'm just refusing to let him walk away from it." Ramirez shook his head, his frustration spilling over. "That's not how it works here. Daniels has been part of this machine for years, knows how to keep it running, knows who to lean on. This precinct doesn't come along without people like him." Sam's eyes flashed, her voice cutting through his defense like a blade. "So that excuses him. That's your justification for letting him slide, because he's useful, because it's easier to ignore what he's doing." Ramirez's tone hardened, a rare crack in his composure. "It's not about ignoring anything, it's about keeping this place from falling apart. Out there, on those streets, it's not about right or wrong. It's about what works. Daniels gets results." "And what kind of results are those?" Sam shot back, her voice rising with a controlled fury. "Arrests with no basis, evidence that disappears when it's convenient, complaints that get buried before anyone can blink. Now he's putting hands on people in me. That's not just bending the rules, Captain, that's breaking them. That's a crime." Ramirez stiffened, his expression darkening as her words hit their mark. For a moment, he seemed poised to argue, his mouth opening slightly, but then he leaned back, his gaze drifting to the ceiling as if searching for answers in the cracked plaster. "You think you're the first to storm in here with a broom, ready to sweep out the dirt," he said, his voice quieter now, tinged with a bitter edge. Sam didn't respond, her silence an invitation for him to keep going. "I've been at this long enough to watch it play out," he continued, his tone low and deliberate. "Someone shows up, all fired up about fixing things, tearing out the rot. They make enemies fast. And when it's over, nothing's different. The system keeps chugging along, and that someone, they're gone." Sam straightened, her voice steady but laced with a quiet intensity. "And you're fine with that? With letting people like Daniels run this place into the ground? Because it's less hassle than fighting back." Ramirez's eyes snapped back to hers, sharp and piercing, a mix of anger and something softer regret, maybe whirling in their depths. "Don't you put that on me," he said, his voice rough. "You think I haven't pushed back? I've gone toe-to-toe with guys like Daniels before. All it's ever done is stir the pot and leave me scraping up the mess." "Maybe that's because no one's seen it through," Sam countered, her words firm and unyielding. "Maybe what this place needs isn't someone who backs off. When it gets hard, it's someone who keeps going, who proves that power doesn't get a free pass to trample over what's right." Ramirez stared at her, his expression unreadable, the weight of her challenge settling between them like dust after a collapse. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence a battlefield of its own. Finally, he sighed, a sound heavy with years of compromise. "You're playing a dangerous game, Carter," he said, his voice low. "Daniels isn't just a loose cannon, he's a cornerstone. You knock him down, and you'd better be ready for what comes crashing after." Sam met his gaze, her resolve unshaken. "I'm not here to play it safe, Captain. I'm here to make sure justice isn't just a word we throw around when it's convenient. If that means taking on Daniels and everyone who's got his back, then so be it." She rose from the chair, her movements deliberate, and headed for the door. As her hand touched the knob, Ramirez's voice stopped her. "Carter." She paused, glancing back. His eyes held hers, a flicker of something like admiration buried beneath the exhaustion. "Just don't expect it to be easy." She gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement, then stepped out into the hall, the door clicking shut behind her. Outside, the precinct hummed with its usual chaos, but inside her, a fire burned, fueled by the certainty that power without accountability was a poison, and she'd be the one to root it out, no matter the cost. Ramirez stood in the dim light of his office, his broad shoulders casting a shadow across the worn wooden floor. The lines etched into his face softened for a fleeting moment as he regarded Sam, though the steel in his eyes never wavered. "You think you're the kind of person who won't back down when things get tough?" he asked, his voice low and probing, carrying the weight of years spent navigating a world where ideals often crumbled under pressure. Sam didn't flinch. "Yes," she replied, her tone steady and resolute, her chin lifting slightly as if to challenge the doubt she sensed lurking behind his question. For a long moment, silence hung between them, thick and heavy. Then Ramirez rose from his chair with deliberate slowness, his movements betraying a weariness he couldn't quite hide. He crossed the room to the window, his boots scuffing faintly against the linoleum, and stopped to gaze out at the sprawling parking lot below. The late afternoon sun glinted off the rows of cars, but his focus seemed far beyond the asphalt. His hands clasped tightly behind his back, knuckles whitening as if anchoring himself against an unseen storm. His shoulders stiffened, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a near whisper, tinged with a regret that seemed to claw at him from within. "There was a case, years back," he began, each word measured, as though he were prying it loose from a locked vault in his memory. "An officer under my command. On paper, he was solid commendations, clean record, but there were whispers, complaints from civilians about rough treatment, little inconsistencies in his reports that didn't add up. I saw them, noted them, but I let them slide, told myself they were minor, not worth stirring the pot over." Sam watched him intently, her hazel eyes narrowing as she sensed the story's weight pressing down on him. She could almost see the scene unfolding in his mind, flickering neon of a precinct hallway, the shuffle of papers, the averted gazes of colleagues who knew more than they'd ever admit. Ramirez's jaw tightened, and he continued, his voice growing raw. Then one day, he went too far. Crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Someone got hurt badly. I reported him, turned in everything I had. But it was too late. The damage was already done, and the department, they circled the wagons. Protected him because it was easier than facing the mess we'd all ignored. I was left standing there, picking up the shards of a system I thought I could trust. He turned to face her then, his expression a tangled mix of resolve and conflict. His dark eyes searching hers for something interesting, perhaps, or absolution. I told myself I'd done all I could, but deep down, I knew the truth. I stayed silent when it mattered most, and that silence cost someone everything. The air in the room seemed to thicken with the echoes of his confession. Sam felt a chill ripple through her, not from fear, but from the stark realization of what his words implied. Justice wasn't a given, it was a fight. And too often, those with power chose convenience over righteousness. Ramirez stepped closer, his gaze hardening again, though a flicker of concern lingered. I don't want that to happen again, Carter, but this playsite's a machine. It doesn't shift gears just because someone like you decides to push. You're walking a tightrope over a fire, and if you slip, it'll swallow you whole. Sam rose to her feet, her posture unyielding, her resolve a blazing ember in her chest. She met his stare head-on, her voice firm but laced with a quiet fire. I'd rather get burned standing up to this than stay warm pretending it doesn't exist. Daniels isn't just a bad apple, he's a symptom of a rot that runs deep. If we don't cut it out, it'll spread until there's nothing worth saving. Ramirez sighed, a heavy, resigned sound, and rubbed the bridge of his nose with a calloused hand. You've got guts, I'll give you that, he muttered, almost to himself. But guts won't shield you when Daniels pushes back, and he will. He's not the type to let a challenge slide. He'll come at you with everything he's got. Then I'll be ready, Sam said simply, her words carrying the weight of a vow. Ramirez studied her for a long, tense moment, his brow furrowing as if weighing her determination against the odds she faced. Finally, he gave a slow nod, a reluctant acknowledgement of her tenacity. Just don't forget this place has a knack for grinding people down. Don't let it drag you under with it. As Sam turned to leave, her boots echoing softly against the floor, his warning didn't shake her. If anything, it stoked the fire within her, hardening her belief that change wasn't just possible, it was essential, no matter the personal cost. She'd stand alone if she had to, a solitary figure against a tide of corruption, determined to expose Daniels and the broken system that propped him up. Later that evening, Samantha Carter sat hunched over a cluttered table in the precinct's records room, surrounded by towering stacks of case files that smelled faintly of mildew and neglect. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like restless insects, casting a harsh, sterile glow across the chaos of paper and ink. She flipped through yet another report, her fingers smudged with dust, her eyes darting across the lines of text with a relentless focus. Each arrest authorized by Officer Jake Daniels seemed to peel back another layer of unease. One file described a man detained for suspicious activity near a convenience store, but the witness statement that should have backed it up was nowhere to be found, just a blank space, where accountability should have been. Another report claimed possession of illegal substances, yet the evidence log was conspicuously empty, as if the drugs had vanished into thin air. And then there were the suspects themselves. Page after page revealed a troubling pattern. Young black men, hauled in on flimsy charges that crumbled in court, leaving no trace but the damage done to their lives. Sam's pulse quickened as she grabbed a fresh stack of files, her mind racing to connect the dots. The deeper she dug, the uglier the picture became. Daniels wasn't just bending the roulette, was shattering them, rewriting the game to suit his own ends. Ours slipped by unnoticed, the world outside the records room fading into a distant hum. She barely registered the creak of the door until a shadow fell across her work. Harris stepped inside, his usual swagger replaced by a cautious, almost hesitant air. He lingered near the threshold, his sharp blue eyes flicking to the files strewn across the table. Then back to her. "Busy day?" he asked, his tone aiming for casual but landing somewhere closer to unease. Sam didn't look up, her pen scratching notes in the margins of a report. "What do you want, Harris?" Her voice was clipped, edged with impatience. He took a step closer, hands shoved deep in his pockets, and glanced at the files again, as if they might bite. "Word's getting around that you're digging into Daniels," he said, lowering his voice. Finally, she met his gaze, her expression guarded, giving nothing away. Harris sighed, dragging a chair over with a scrape that echoed in the quiet room. He sank into it across from her, crossing his arms over his chest. "Look, I might have something you wanted to see." Sam arched an eyebrow, skepticism flickering in her eyes. "Why the sudden generosity?" she asked, leaning back slightly. Harris smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say I've seen enough to know he's not as bulletproof as he thinks. And if he's going down, I'm not sinking with him." She studied him, searching for the catch. But his posture tense, almost defensive, suggested he was more rattled than he let on. After a beat, she nodded for him to go on. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small USB drive, sliding it across the table with a faint clink. "This has stuff Daniels thought he'd buried: arrest records, witness statements, complaints that got shredded before they hit the sergeant's desk." Sam picked up the drive, her fingers tightening around it as she weighed his words. "Why do you have this?" she asked, her tone sharp. Harris shrugged, but his eyes darted away for a split second. "Because I don't trust him either. I've been keeping tabs. He's gotten sloppy to full of himself. It was only a matter of time before someone like you came along." She plugged the drive into her laptop, the screen flickering to life with a cascade of files. As she scrolled, her stomach twisted into knots. The evidence was a gut punch: cases closed with no explanation, suspects bullied into confessions, and financial trails that reeked of bribes. "This is solid," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Why haven't you taken it to Ramirez?" Harris let out a bitter laugh, leaning back in his chair. "Because Ramirez won't move unless his hand's forced. And let's be honest, you're the only one crazy enough to take Daniels head on." Sam's gaze snapped to his, unflinching. "If you're playing both sides, Harris, this ends ugly for you." He raised his hands in mock surrender, his tone earnest for once. "I'm not. But there's more you need to know." She closed the laptop with a soft click, leaning forward, her voice a low demand. "What?" Harris glanced around the empty room, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Daniels isn't a lone wolf. He's got people guys in the precinct who turn a blind eye or clean up his messes. When things get dicey." Sam's stomach sank, a cold dread settling in her bones. "Names." She pressed. He hesitated, then shook his head. "No hard proof yet, but I know some of the old-timers have his back. They're neck deep in the same filth: bribes, fake evidence, the works. You go after Daniels, you're kicking a hornet's nest." Her jaw clenched, a spark of defiance flaring in her chest. "Good," she said, her voice steel. "It's about damn time someone did." The next morning, Sam arrived at the precinct before the sun had fully risen. The sky outside still bruised with streaks of purple and gray. Armed with Harris's intel, she set to work cross-referencing Daniels' questionable arrests with internal records. The connections leaped off the Pagus: names of senior officers popping up again and again, their signatures on reports that didn't add up. The precinct hummed faintly around her, the distant clatter of keyboards and muffled voices a stark contrast to the storm brewing in her mind. At one point, Ramirez paused by her desk, his brow creasing as he took in the growing fortress of papers around her. "You've been busy," he said, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. "Just doing my job," she replied, not glancing up from her work. His gaze lingered, heavy with unspoken questions, before he spoke again. "Be careful, Carter. You're stirring up things that don't take kindly to being stirred." She met his eyes briefly, her response simple but firm. "I know." He shook his head, a faint flicker of worry crossing his face, then walked away, leaving her to her crusade. By mid-afternoon, she tracked Harris down again, cornering him in a quiet alcove near the break room. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and stale donuts, and the hum of the precinct felt miles away. "I need more," she said bluntly, her arms crossed. He raised an eyebrow, feigning confusion. "More what?" "Proof," she shot back. "You said Daniels has people covering for him. I need something concrete to tie them together." Harris rubbed the back of his neck, exasperation creeping into his voice. "You're not letting this go, are you?" "No," she said, her tone leaving no room for debate. After a long pause, he nodded, relenting. "There's a locker in the basement. Daniels stashes stuff there, things he doesn't want on the books. I don't know what's inside. But if there's dirt on anyone, that's where it'll be." Her eyes narrowed. "How do you know about it?" Harris shifted uncomfortably, his voice low. "I've seen him use it. But you didn't hear that from me." That evening, Sam descended into the precinct's basement, her heart hammering against her ribs. The air was damp and cool, the flickering lights casting long shadows across the rows of battered lockers. She found the one Harris had described, its number scratched faintly into the metal. The lock gleamed defiantly, but she'd come prepared. With a quick glance over her shoulder, she pulled out a pair of bolt cutters, the cold steel biting into her palms. The lock gave way with a sharp snap, and the door groaned open. Inside, she found a trough folders bulging with papers, a few unmarked envelopes, and a lone flash drive. She didn't linger to sift through them there. Instead, she shoved everything into her bag and slipped out, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. Back in her cramped apartment, Sam spread the haul across her kitchen table, the dim glow of a single lamp illuminating the chaos. The folders held more falsified reports, each one a brick in the wall of Danielle's deceit. But the envelopes stopped her cold, stuffed with cash, crisp bills that screamed payoffs from someone with a vested interest in his silence. The flash drive was the clincher. She plugged it in, and her screen filled with a damning archive emails, text messages, even audio clips of Daniels barking orders to other officers, orchestrating cover-ups, intimidating witnesses, and pocketing bribes. Sam leaned back in her chair, the enormity of it all crashing over her like a tidal wave. This wasn't just about Daniels anymore. It was a sprawling network, a cancer eating away at the precinct's core. Armed with this proof, she knew she was no longer chasing a single rogue cop. She was staring down a beast with many heads. To bring it down, she'd have to move with precision, bracing herself for the backlash that was sure to follow. It began subtly the next morning, a low murmur rippling through the precinct as Sam arrived. She caught sight of a cluster of officers huddled around a desk, their voices hushed but urgent, their glances darting toward her before skittering away. At first, she brushed it off, chalking it up to the usual gossip that swirled through the ranks. But as the day wore on, the tension thickened, a palpable undercurrent that set her nerves on edge. She couldn't shake the feeling that the hornet's nest Harris had warned her about was already buzzing, stirred by the weight of what she'd uncovered. Justice, she realized, wasn't just a lofty ideal, it was a reckoning, a mirror held up to those who'd abused their power. And as the consequences loomed closer, Sam steeled herself for the fight ahead, knowing that exposing this corruption would demand everything she had and more. The air in the precinct felt heavier than usual, thick with unspoken tension, as Lieutenant Sam Carter sifted through a growing stack of files tied to Officer Daniels. She'd been hunched over her desk for hours, the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, when she noticed the shift. Eyes flicked toward her, some fleeting, some lingering, while hushed voices rippled through the room like a rising tide. Her instincts prickled. Something was off, and it wasn't just the weight of the paperwork. She straightened, her sharp gaze cutting through the dim haze of the office, when a voice broke her focus. "Lieutenant Carter," Harris called, his tone steady, but his face a blank slate, impossible to read. He stood near a flickering monitor in the corner, his hand hovering as if unsure whether to beckon her closer. Sam's boots clicked against the worn linoleum as she crossed the room, her chest tightening with every step. "What is it?" she asked, her words clipped, betraying the unease coiling in her gut. Harris hesitated, his fingers twitching over the keyboard before he pressed play. The screen jolted to life, and there it was, a grainy, shaky video that hit her like a punch to the stomach. It was her, caught in the common area, locked in that heated moment with Daniels. His meaty hand clamped around her arm, his voice dripping with venom as he snarled, "You're about to learn how things work around here." The footage trembled, then cut to black, but the echo of his words lingered, sharp and accusing. Sam's stomach twisted into a knot. "Where did this come from?" she demanded, her eyes narrowing as she turned to Harris. He shrugged, his shoulders slumping slightly as he avoided her gaze, his voice low. It's everywhere. Social media. Someone leaked the security footage. Her mind raced. Within hours, the video had exploded online, a wildfire tearing through the digital landscape. News vans rolled up outside the Eastbridge Police Department, their satellite dishes piercing the gray sky like spears. Reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing, microphones poised like vultures circling a carcass. They spliced the clip into breathless segments, each one painting a damning portrait of intimidation and corruption festering within these walls. Inside, the precinct turned into a pressure cooker. Some officers dodged her entirely, their eyes skittering away as if she carried a plague. Others glared, their hostility a tangible force pressing against her as she moved through the halls. Daniels himself had vanished, a ghost haunting the edges of her awareness. But his presence loomed like a storm cloud. Sam found Captain Ramirez in his office, pacing like a caged animal behind his cluttered desk. His tie hung loose, his sleeves rolled up, and the phone was still warm in his hand when he slammed it down. He spun to face her, his features drawn tight with exhaustion and something darker dread, maybe. "This is a disaster," he said, his voice raw, skipping any pleasantries. Sam crossed her arms, her stance firm despite the chaos swirling around her. "Why?" she shot back, her tone daring him to justify the panic. Ramirez shook his head, frustration flashing in his dark eyes. "Because people are finally seeing the truth in this precinct under a microscope now. You have no idea what's coming. Internal affairs, the media, the mayors of Feist, they're all about to descend on us like locusts." Sam didn't flinch. "Good," she said, her voice steady as steel. "They should." His patience snapped. Ramirez's hand slammed onto the desk, the sound ricocheting off the walls. "This isn't about justice anymore, Carter. This is a political firestorm. And you've dumped gasoline on it." Sam held her ground, her jaw tightening as she met his glare. "I didn't leak the video, Captain, but I'm not going to apologize for what it shows." Daniels crossed a line of Ryan knows it now. Ramirez exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his thinning hair, his anger giving way to something heavier. "And what happens when the rest of the department decides you're the enemy? Daniels is already rallying his loyalists. They're saying you're trying to burn this place to the ground." Sam's eyes flashed with defiance. "Maybe it needs to burn. This isn't just about Daniels, it's about everyone who's propped him up. Look the other way. Let him run wild." For a moment, Ramirez said nothing, his shoulders sagging as he sank into his chair. His voice, when it came, was quiet, weighted with resignation. "You don't get it, Carter. This isn't one bad cop. It's a system that shields itself, no matter the cost." "Then it's time to break that system," Sam replied, her words ringing with conviction. Outside, the crowd of reporters swelled, their voices a relentless hum pressing against the precinct's brick walls. When Sam finally stepped into the cold March air, the onslaught hit her like a wave. Microphones jabbed at her face, questions tumbling over one another in a frantic rush. "Lieutenant Carter, can you comment on the video? Is Officer Daniels being suspended? Is this part of a broader corruption probe?" She raised a hand, silencing the clamor with a single gesture. "I can't comment on an ongoing investigation," she said, her voice cutting through the noise with calm authority. "But I'll say this, no one is above the law, not even those who wear the badge." The statement only stoked the frenzy, cameras clicking like gunfire as she turned back inside. Ramirez was waiting in the hallway, his expression a mask of grim disapproval. "You're making this worse," he said, his tone low and accusing. Sam didn't waver. "No, I'm making it better. It just doesn't feel that way yet." That night, alone in her sparse apartment, Sam spread the evidence across her kitchen table, files from Harris, reports unearthed from the basement locker, and now the fallout from the video. Each piece slotted into a mosaic of corruption and cowardice that had festered in the department. For years, her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. An unknown number. The message was short, chilling. "You don't know what you're messing with. Back off." Her pulse quickened, but her resolve hardened. It could have been Daniels, one of his cronies, or someone higher up the chain. It didn't matter. She wasn't stopping. The next morning, the precinct simmered with tension so thick it felt like walking through fog. Officers huddled in tight knots, their whispers dying the moment Sam approached. Then Daniels reappeared, striding through the bullpen like a predator reclaiming his territory. His face was a storm of shadow and fury as he headed for Ramirez's office. Sam watched him go, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. Harris sidled up beside her, his usual easy demeanor replaced with a cautious edge. "You've kicked a hornet's nest," he murmured, his voice barely above a breath. "Good," Sam replied, her eyes still fixed on Daniels' retreating figure. "Maybe it's time the nest came down." Harris shifted, leaning closer, his words urgent. "Be careful. Daniels isn't just mad scared, and scared people do reckless things." Sam met his gaze, unflinching. "I can handle Daniels." Harris shook his head, his brow creasing with worry. "It's not just him. There are people here who'll defend him to the end. Watch your back." The warning echoed too late. By noon, Daniels had shed all pretense, openly rallying his allies. Sam overheard him in the break room, his voice a low growl as he addressed a cluster of officers. "She thinks she can waltz in here and rip everything apart. We're not letting that happen." The air crackled as Sam stepped into the room, her presence slicing through the tension like a blade. "If you've got something to say, Daniels, say it to me." He turned, his eyes narrowing into slits of ice. "Oh, I think I've said plenty." Sam didn't back down. "Good. Because the evidence will say the rest. You think a few files and a leaked video won't touch you? You're more naive than I thought." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You underestimated me, Daniels. That was your first mistake. Your second was thinking no one would care what you've done. They care knowing your reckoning's coming." The room fell silent, a standoff frozen in time as Daniels glared at her, his bravado faltering under her unyielding stare. By the next day, the precinct's atmosphere had shifted into something colder, more deliberate. Officers whispered in corners, their conversations cutting off whenever Sam drew near. Daniels no longer bothered with subtlety. His defiance was a banner wave for all to see. He'd gathered a loyal crew, men who owed him debts or shared his contempt for her. Their plan crystallized fast, sabotage her at every turn. When Sam reached for a file at the record's desk, the officer behind the counter, a weary guy named Phelps with a perpetual smirk, gave her a slow, insolent look. "Sorry, Lieutenant. That one's not available right now." Her voice sharpened, a blade honed by frustration. "It's an open case. Hand it over." Phelps hesitated, his eyes flicking over her shoulder. She didn't need to look to know Daniels was watching, his presence a heavy shadow. "It's fine," Daniels called from across the room, his tone thick with mockery. "Give the lieutenant what she wants. We wouldn't want her thinking we're uncooperative." Phelps slid the file across the counter with a grudging shove. Sam snatched it up, her jaw locked tight as she walked away, the weight of their stares boring into her back. That night, back in her apartment, the phone rang, an unknown number again. She answered, her grip firm on the receiver. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Daniels' voice slithered through the line, calm but laced with menace. Sam didn't flinch. "If you're trying to scare me, you're wasting your breath." His tone hardened. "You think this is a game? You're poking around where you don't belong, Carter. People are noticing, and not in the way you think." She leaned back in her chair, her voice cool and unwavering. "What's wrong, Daniels? Scared I'm getting too close to the truth?" A pause, then a low, chilling chuckle. "You don't get it. This isn't just me. There are people who'll do anything to protect what we've built. Keep pushing, and you'll see how far we'll go." The line went dead. Sam stared at the phone, her heart steady despite the threat's gravity. Daniels wasn't bluffing, but neither was she. The next morning, she arrived at the precinct before dawn, determined to outpace his schemes. She'd barely crossed the threshold when Harris intercepted her, his face pale and drawn. "Carter," he said, pulling her into a shadowed corner, his voice urgent. "You need to know what's happening." She braced herself. "What now?" Harris glanced around, his words hushed. "Daniels has been meeting with some of the guys after hours. They're covering his track, shredding files, rewriting reports, anything to make sure nothing sticks." Sam's jaw tightened, anger flaring hot in her chest. "And you're just telling me this now?" Harris raised his hands, defensive but earnest. "I'm telling you because you're in deeper than you realize. This isn't just Daniels anymore. It's a machine. and it's turning against you. The lesson was stark. Justice wasn't a straight path but a battlefield, and power, when abused, bred consequences that rippled far beyond the guilty. Daniels thought he was untouchable, a king in a corrupt kingdom. But Sam saw the cracks. Every overreach, every threat, every ally he rallied only tightened the noose. The system might protect itself, as Ramirez warned, but it wasn't invincible. Sam wasn't just fighting one man. She was challenging the rot that had taken root. The enablers who thrived in silence, the cowardice that let men like Daniels reign. And as the precinct's walls closed in, she knew the cost of that fight might be steep, but the cost of surrender was far greater. The precinct was a labyrinth of shadows and secrets that evening, its flickering fluorescent lights casting long, jagged shapes across the worn linoleum floors. Sam Carter lingered late, her desk a chaotic sprawl of files she'd wrested from the jaws of destruction. Before Daniels could erase his sins, her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the electric surge of determination pulsing through Harrah's. She pieced together the sprawling web of his corruption. Each document was a thread, each memo a knot, revealing a tapestry of greed and betrayal that stretched far beyond what she'd ever imagined. But as the hours ticked by, a gnawing realization settled in her gut. Suspicion wasn't enough. She needed something concrete, something irrefutably a smoking gun that would bind Daniels and his cronies to their crimes, with chains of cold, hard evidence. Locking her office door behind her, the metallic click echoed in the empty hallway like a judge's gavel. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, sharp and insistent, jolting her from her thoughts. Another unknown number glared from the screen. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the button, a flicker of unease tightening her chest. Then, with a steadying breath, she answered. The voice on the other end was unmistakable. Denise, his tone stripped of its usual oily arrogance, replaced by an icy edge that sent a shiver down her spine. "You really don't learn, do you, Carter?" he said, each word deliberate, dripping with menace. "I warned you, but you're too damn stubborn to back off." Sam's grip on the phone tightened, her knuckles whitening, but her voice remained a calm, defiant shield. "Is this the part where you threaten me again, Daniels?" she asked, her words steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "No," he replied, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "This is the part where I remind you that accidents happen. Bad things happen to people who don't know when to stop pushing." The threat hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Her heart pounded, but she refused to let it show. "And this is the part where I remind you that I don't scare easily," she shot back, her tone unwavering, a spark of fire in the darkness. There was a pause, a heavy silence that stretched between them, then a low, chilling laugh slithered through the line. "You're going to regret this," Daniels said, and with that, the call cut off, leaving only the dead hum of disconnection. Sam stood frozen for a moment, the weight of his words pressing against her chest. She didn't go home that night. Instead, she dialed Ramirez, her voice urgent as she requested an emergency meeting. When she arrived at his office, the captain was already there, his broad frame silhouetted against the dim glow of a desk lamp. His face was etched with exhaustion and something darker, resignation. Perhaps as he gestured for her to sit, but Sam remained standing, her posture rigid, her resolve unyielding. "Daniels is organizing a resistance," she said, her voice firm, cutting through the stillness. "He's shredding evidence, rewriting reports, and now he's threatening me directly." Ramirez sighed, his thick fingers rubbing at his temples as if he could massage away the chaos unfolding around them. "This is getting out of control," he muttered, his gravelly voice heavy with frustration. "It's already out of control," Sam snapped, her patience fraying. "He's not just covering his tracks, he's trying to crush anyone who dares to stand up to him. If we don't act now, he'll bury everything, and we'll be left with nothing but ashes." Her words crackled with urgency, her eyes blazing with a fierce determination that dared him to disagree. Ramirez studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching hers, weighing her resolve against the storm they were about to unleash. Then, with a slow nod, he relented. "What do you need?" he asked, his tone shifting from weariness to resolve. "I need access to every record Daniels has touched in the last 6 months, Sam said, her voice steady but insistent. "Emails, Call logs, surveillance footage, everything. And I need to know who he's been meeting with after hours. It was a demand, not a request. And the weight of it hung between them. Ramirez hesitated, his hand hovering over the phone on his desk. Then, with a decisive motion, he picked it up. "You'll have it by morning," he promised, his voice low but firm. Daniel's defiance had reached a breaking point, and the battle lines were drawn in the sand. But as Sam left the office, her mind raced with the knowledge that this was only the beginning. The closer she edged to the truth, the more treacherous the path became. A tightrope stretched over a pit of vipers, yet she was ready to walk it, to fight, to see justice served, no matter the cost. Under the faint, flickering glow of streetlights, the old warehouse loomed ahead, its rusted skeleton casting a jagged shadow across the cracked asphalt. Sam parked her car a block away, her heartbeat a steady drumbeat against the tension coiling in her veins. She stepped out into the cool night air, her breath visible in faint wisps as she scanned the desolate street. Moments later, Ramirez and Harris arrived, their cruiser pulling up with a soft crunch of gravel. Ramirez emerged first, his broad shoulders hunched slightly as he surveyed the area, his sharp eyes glinting with caution. Harris followed, younger and leaner, his movements precise and deliberate, a coiled spring ready to strike. "This is where he's holed up?" Ramirez asked, his voice a low rumble as he squinted at the warehouse's looming silhouette. Sam nodded, her jaw tight. "According to the intel, he's been using it to stash files and meet his allies. If we're going to catch him, it's here." "Let's move," Ramirez said, his tone clipped, decisive. The three advanced toward the building, their footsteps muffled against the uneven pavement, each breath measured, each glance calculated. Harris tested the side door, its hinges groaning in protest as it swung open, a sound that seemed to echo with foreboding through the still night. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with the mingled scents of oil and mildew, a stale reminder of neglect. Somewhere in the depths of the warehouse, a faint hum of machinery buzzed, masking their movements as they ventured deeper into the darkness. Ramirez raised a hand, halting them mid-step. A soft scuffle drifted from the far corner, followed by a low, indistinct mutter. "He's here," Harris whispered, his voice barely audible, his hand already resting on his weapon. Sam gestured for them to fan out, her own hand brushing the cool metal of her sidearm as she crept toward the sound. Her steps were light but purposeful, her senses heightened, every shadow a potential threat. "Carter," a voice sliced through the gloom, stopping her cold. Daniels emerged from the darkness, his tall frame cutting a sharp silhouette against the fractured light, spilling through broken windows. Gone was the smirk she'd come to loathe. In its place was a cold, calculating glare that sent a chill racing down her spine. "Took you long enough," he said, his voice smooth but laced with venom. "Drop the act, Daniels," Sam replied, her tone steady, unflinching. "It's over." "Over," he let out a low, bitter chuckle, the sound reverberating off the damp walls. "You think waltzing in here with a badge and a gun changes anything? You're out of your depth." "Carter." Sam didn't flinch, her gaze locked on his. "We have everything we need, your files, your emails, the evidence you've tried so hard to bury. It's all coming to light." Daniels tilted his head, his eyes narrowing to slits. "And what makes you think anyone's going to care? This place doesn't run on your precious sense of justice. It runs on loyalty. You think you've won, but you don't even understand the game." A faint rustle behind her caught her attention, and she glanced sideways, catching the flicker of Harris circling through the shadows, his weapon drawn. Ramirez held his ground near the entrance, a silent sentinel ready to move. "I understand plenty," Sam said, her voice cutting through the tension. "You've built your little empire on fear and intimidation, but it's crumbling, Daniels. And you know it." He took a step closer, his hands loose at his sides but taut with restrained energy. "You think you're better than me, some kind of savior. You're just a pawn, Carter. They'll chew you up and spit you out like they do everyone else." "Maybe," she conceded, her tone cool, resolute. "But at least I won't go down as a coward hiding behind corruption to save his own skin." Daniel's jaw clenched, his face a mask of barely contained rage. For a moment, the warehouse fell silent, the air thick with anticipation, a wire stretched to its breaking point. Then, in a blur of motion, Daniels lunged, his hand flashing toward a knife hidden at his side. Sam reacted instinctively, stepping back and drawing her weapon in one fluid motion. "Freeze!" she shouted, her voice booming through the cavernous space. But Daniels didn't stop. He surged forward, desperation fueling his movements, the blade slicing through the air as Sam sidestepped. A gunshot cracked through the silenciometers, firing a warning shot into the ceiling, the sound ricocheting off the walls like thunder. "Drop it, Daniels," he barked, his voice a growl of authority. Daniels hesitated, his wild eyes darting between Sam and Ramirez, the knife trembling in his grip. For a fleeting second, surrender seemed possible. Then, with a snarl, he turned and bolted toward the far exit. Harris was on him in an instant, launching himself forward and tackling Daniels to the ground. The knife skittered across the concrete as they grappled, Daniels swinging a frantic punch that Harris deftly blocked, pinning him down with a grunt of effort. "Enough," Ramirez roared, rushing over to assist. Together, he and Harris hauled Daniels to his feet, his wrists snapping into handcuffs with a satisfying click. Breathing heavily, Daniels glared at Sam, his defiance unbroken even as Ramirez recited his rights in a steady monotone. "You think this changes anything?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You haven't won. You don't even know what you're up against." Sam stepped closer, her expression icy, unyielding. "I know enough," she said. "And this is just the beginning." Daniels smirked, a twisted grimace, as Ramirez shoved him toward the exit. "We'll see, Carter," he muttered. "We'll see." Outside, the night air hit them like a bracing wave, sharp and cool against their flushed skin. Harris leaned against the patrol car, catching his breath, his usually steady hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline. Ramirez called for backup, his voice clipped and professional, while Sam watched Daniels being loaded into the cruiser. Even in defeat, his posture radiated defiance, his eyes locking with hers one last time before the door slammed shut. Ramirez approached her, his weathered face unreadable. "We got him," Sam said, her tone somber, tempered by the weight of what lay ahead. "For now." Ramirez nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "Yeah, but he's right, this isn't over." Daniels was in custody, but his cryptic taunts lingered in Sam's mind like a dark cloud. The deeper she dug, the more she uncovered a corruption that stretched far beyond one man, its roots twisting through the precinct and beyond. The stakes had never been higher, and the fight for justice had only just begun, a lesson etched in every shadow, every choice, every consequence of power abused. By the next morning, the precinct was a hive of tension, its usual hum of quiet efficiency shattered by the arrival of internal affairs. They descended on Eastbridge like a swarm, their crisp suits and clipped voices cutting through the chaos as they rifled through files, interrogated officers, and peeled back the station's carefully crafted veneer. Sam sat in Ramirez's office, a towering stack of documents spread before her, each page a testament to the rot she was determined to excise. Across the desk, Ramirez looked haggard, his phone buzzing relentlessly with calls from the mayor's office, reporters, and other precincts clamoring for answers. "They're digging into everything," he said, his voice low, strained. "Complaints, case files. Personnel records isn't just about Daniels anymore." "It never was," Sam replied, her tone calm but resolute, a quiet strength underpinning her words. Ramirez shook his head, a faint grimace tugging at his lips. "You realize what you've started, don't you? They're talking about a full departmental audit. Officers are going to be suspended, made worse. They should be," Sam said firmly, her gaze unwavering, "if they've been complicit. They don't belong here. Justice doesn't bend for loyalty to the wrong people." Her words carried the weight of a vow, a reminder that the pursuit of truth came with a cost she was willing to pay. Ramirez leaned back in his chair, his expression a mix of admiration and unease. "Not everyone sees it that way, Carter. You've made enemies." As Sam stepped out of his office, the hostility in the air was palpable, a living thing that pressed against her with every step. Conversations halted as she passed, officers exchanging sharp, sit-along glances that spoke volumetrament, suspicion, fear. "Traitor," someone muttered under their breath, the word a dagger aimed at her back. Sam kept her head high, her stride unbroken, but the weight of their disdain clung to her like damp fog. In the locker room, Harris approached, his lean frame tense, his brown eyes shadowed with concern. He'd been her shadow through the warehouse raid, his quick reflexes a lifeline in the chaos. And now he stood before her, a reluctant bearer of hard truths. "They're turning on you," he said quietly, his voice tight with unease. "You're stirring up a hornet's nest, Sam, and not everyone's going to thank you for it." She met his gaze, her own eyes steady, resolute. "I didn't start this to be thanked, Harris. I started it because it's right. Daniels abused his power, and the fallout's on him, not us." Her words were a quiet fire, a testament to the lesson she'd learned. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed by the grateful, but a battle won through courage, a reckoning for those who wielded power without conscience. And as the precinct fractured around her, Sam knew the war was far from over, but she was ready to fight it, step by unflinching step. The precinct's air buzzed with an uneasy quiet as Harris slouched against the wall, his posture casual but his eyes sharp with concern. "You're not exactly the belle of the ball around here, you know," he said, his voice low, carrying a mix of dry humor and unspoken worry. Sam didn't even glance up from shoving her worn-out duffel bag into her locker, the metal door creaking under her forceful push. "Good thing I'm not here to win friends," she shot back, her tone clipped but steady, betraying none of the exhaustion she felt deep in her bones. Harris shifted his weight, his boots scuffing the tiled floor as he leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a near whisper. "You get that they're pinning this whole mess on you, right? Daniels might be history, but half these guys think you handed the precinct over to the IA on a silver platter." Sam's hands froze mid-motion, her fingers tightening around the locker's edge. She turned to face him, her jaw set and her eyes blazing with a quiet fury. "I didn't sell anyone out," she said, each word deliberate, cutting through the air like a blade. "I dragged corruption out into the open where it couldn't hide anymore. If they're mad about that, it's their guilty consciences talking, not mine." Harris hesitated, his brow furrowing as he weighed her words. He wasn't one to argue with conviction like hers, and after a beat, he gave a slow nod, though his expression remained clouded. "Just keep your eyes peeled, Carter. Not everyone around here fights fair." The tension simmering beneath the precinct's surface erupted the next morning during a briefing that felt more like a powder keg than a meeting. Ramirez stood at the front of the room, his broad shoulders squared under his crisp uniform, addressing the sea of officers sprawled across mismatched chairs. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered faintly, casting harsh shadows across his weathered face as he spoke. "We're in rough waters right now," he began, his voice gravelly but firm. "The IIA's digging deep, and we've got no choice but to cooperate fully. This department's got to run clean top to bottom." His words hung heavy, met with a ripple of uneasy shifting from the crowd. Then from the back, a sharp scoff sliced through the room's fragile calm. Sam's head snapped around, her gaze landing on Officer Miller, Daniel's old right-hand man. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed tight over his chest, his sneer practically dripping venom. "Integrity," he drawled, sarcasm lacing every syllable. "That's a hell of a word coming from someone who let an outsider waltz in here and rip us to shreds." The room went still, every pair of eyes darting between Miller and Sam like spectators at a prize fight. She rose slowly from her seat, her movements deliberate, her voice dropping to a chilling calm. "Got something to say, Miller?" He didn't hesitate, stepping forward with a swagger that barely masked the anger simmering beneath his skin. "Yeah, Carter, I do. You think you're some kind of saint, don't you? Riding in on your high horse, flushing out the bad apples. But all you've done is paint a bullseye on every one of us." His words were a challenge, his stance aggressive, but Sam didn't flinch. "If you're scared of being seen for what you are," she replied, her tone steady as steel, "maybe it's time to check your own reflection." Miller's face twisted, his fists clenching as he took another step closer, the air between them crackling with hostility. Before he could escalate it further, Ramirez's voice boomed across the room. "That's enough. Miller, back to your desk now." Miller shot Sam one last searing glare, his boots stomping the floor as he stormed out, the door slamming shut behind him with a resounding bang that echoed through the silence. The days that followed turned the precinct into a whirlwind of chaos and unease. II investigators swept through like a relentless tempest, their polished shoes clicking against the linoleum as they hauled away files, and questioned officers in hushed, urgent tones. Desks once cluttered with coffee mugs and paperwork sat empty, their owners suspended pending further review, while the remaining staff watched with wary eyes. Sam found herself dragged into a relentless cycle of meetings, each one a grueling test of her resolve. In one particularly tense session, an IA investigator, a weary man with a sharp jaw and sharper questions, leaned back in his chair, studying her like a specimen under glass. "You've kicked up one hell of a storm, Lieutenant," he said, his voice smooth but edged with accusation. Sam met his gaze without blinking, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I'm doing my job," she replied, her words simple but unyielding. He tilted his head, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "It's not just Daniels, you know. The deeper we dig, the more rot we find. This place has been festering for years." Sam's response came without hesitation, her voice cutting through the room's stale air. "Then it's long past time someone scrubbed it clean." By week's end, the precinct resembled a war zone, its one-state bonds shattered beyond recognition. Officers who'd once given Sam curt nods in the hallways now sidestepped her entirely, their conversations falling silent as she passed. The camaraderie that had once fueled the team lay in ruins, replaced by a brittle mistrust that clung to every interaction. Late one night, long after the last shift had trickled out, Sam sat alone at her desk, the dim glow of her lamp casting long shadows across the scattered IA reports. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the building's aging heater. She sifted through her notes, piecing together the tangled web of events that had led to Daniel's downfall and the cascading consequences that followed. Each page revealed a new thread of corruption, stretching further and deeper than she'd ever imagined. Her phone buzzed sharply against the desk, jolting her from her thoughts. The message was brief, its words stark against the screen. "You think this is over. It's not." Her fingers tightened around the device, a flicker of unease sparking in her chest. But she shoved it down hard. Fear wasn't an option now, not when she'd come this far. Daniel's arrest had peeled back the precinct's facade, exposing a system so broken it seemed to groan under its own weight. But it had also cemented one truth in Sam's mind. The rot wasn't just one man, it was a sickness that had taken root long before her arrival. Her resolve solidified, cold and unbreakable. She'd see this through, no matter what it cost her. The fallout left Eastbridge Precinct adrift, its officers moving through their shifts like ghosts, each step heavy with uncertainty. The usual rhythm of chatter and clinking coffee pots had given way to a strained, awkward stillness that pressed against the walls. Sam stood at the head of the conference room, a thick stack of papers gripped in her hands, her posture rigid with determination. Ramirez sat to her right, his arms crossed tightly, his dark eyes scanning the room as officers filed in. Some avoided looking at her altogether, their heads bowed as if studying the scuffed floor. Others glared openly, their resentment a palpable force. When she spoke, her voice cut through the tension like a whip. "We're here to chart the future of this department," she said, each word ringing with unshakable clarity. "The IA investigation has laid it bare. The old ways are dead." A low murmur stirred the room, but she pressed on undeterred. "Starting today, we're rolling out reforms to tackle the systemic failures that got us here. These aren't suggestions, they're orders." She slapped a document onto the table, the sound sharp in the hushed space. Ramirez leaned forward, his voice steady as bedrock. "Lieutenant Carter has my backing on this. We're rebuilding trust inside these walls and out in the streets we swore to protect." From the back, Miller let out a derisive snort, his arms still crossed, his posture radiating defiance. "You think a few shiny new rules will fix this dump?" he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Sam's eyes locked onto his, her voice dropping to an icy edge. "It's a start. And if you can't stomach it, there's the exit." His glare intensified, but he held his tongue, the challenge unspoken but electric. Sam laid out the plan with precision. Mandatory body cameras for every officer, with strict penalties for tampering, quarterly ethics training to hammer home accountability, and a new oversight committee to shine a light on every complaint and misstep. The room absorbed her words in heavy silence. The weight of the changes settling over them like a storm cloud. Ramirez broke the quiet, his tone measured but firm. This isn't about tearing anyone down for kicks. It's about making this place something we can stand behind. A younger officer raised a tentative hand, his voice shaky. Captain, what about resources? We're already running on fumes. Sam didn't miss a beat. We're reallocating funds, cutting the fat from useless projects. If we want this precinct to work, integrity's got to come before comfort. After the meeting, Ramirez caught up with her in the hallway, his usual gruffness softened by a rare note of approval. You held your own in there, he said, pausing to lean against the wall. Sam shrugged, her expression guarded. They'll push back. He nodded, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. They will, but they'll adapt or they won't have a choice. She studied him, searching for any hint of doubt. I wasn't sure you'd stand with me on this, he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Neither was I, at first, but seeing how far the rot's spread, he couldn't ignore it anymore. You were right, Carter. We can't keep limping along like we always have. Not everyone welcomed the shift. Within days, a handful of officers put in for transfers, unwilling to bend to the new regime. Others, like Miller, dug in their heels, finding subtle ways to gum up the work's missed deadlines. Half-hearted compliance. One afternoon, Ramirez summoned Sam to his office, sliding a grievance form across his cluttered desk. Miller's stirring the pot, he said, his tone dry. She skimmed the page, her jaw tightening as she read his claim. The reforms were discriminatory, breeding an atmosphere of distrust. That's the point, she said bluntly, tossing the paper back. Ramirez chuckled, a rare sound that broke the tension. Knew you'd say that. I've got it under control. He'll either fall in line or dig his own grave. Amid the resistance, flickers of hope emerged. Younger officers like Harris began to step up, throwing their weight behind the changes. During a training session, he caught Sam's eye, a sheepish grin breaking through his usual reserve. Never thought I'd admit it, Carter, but you've got my respect. This place was overdue for a shake-up. His words lingered with her, a small but steady light in the storm. Justice, she realized, wasn't just about exposing the guilty. It was about facing the consequences of power run wild and building something stronger from the wreckage. The air in the precinct felt different now, heavier yet somehow lighter all at once. As Sam leaned against the edge of her desk, her fingers tracing the worn wood absent-mindedly. A shake-up like this, and you didn't back down, she murmured to herself, replaying the words she'd said to Harris earlier that day. Her voice had been steady then, measured, masking the storm of doubt that had churned inside her for weeks. Let's just hope it sticks. She let out a slow breath, the kind that carried exhaustion and cautious hope in equal measure. Harris had been quick to respond, his deep voice cutting through her uncertainty like a blade. It will, he'd said, his confidence unwavering, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a fire that made her believe, if only for a moment, that they could pull this off. You've already done the hardest part, making people care. By the end of the month, the changes they'd fought for were no longer just ideas scratched onto paper. They were alive, breathing, taking root in the precinct's cracked foundation. Body cameras blinked red on every officer's chest, a constant reminder that someone was watching. The first round of ethics training had wrapped up, leaving behind a murmur of reluctant agreement among the ranks. The Oversight Committee, a group of stern-faced civilians and retired cops, had settled into their new role, poring over case files with a scrutiny that made even the most seasoned officers shift uncomfortably. In their seats, Sam walked through the precinct's bustling halls, her boots clicking against the scuffed linoleum, her sharp eyes catching every detail. The air wasn't as thick with hostility anymore. It hadn't vanished, not entirely, but it had softened, muted into something closer to begrudging acceptance. Officers who once shot her glares now avoided her gaze, their resentment simmering beneath the surface, but no longer boiling over. Near the evidence room, its steel door gleaming dully under flickering fluorescent lights, Ramirez caught up with her. His broad frame filled the narrow hallway, his thoughtful expression softening the hard lines of his weathered face. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he spoke, people listened. You've done a lot in a short time, he said, his voice low. carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too many battles to count. Sam stopped, turning to face him, her arms crossing over her chest as she considered his words. "There's still more to do," she replied, her tone firm but tinged with a quiet weariness. Ramirez tilted his head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "There always will be," he said, his dark eyes meeting hers with a knowing glint. "But this is a good start." Sam nodded, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones. "It's a foundation," she said, her voice steadier now. "Now we just have to keep building." The precinct had begun to hum with a new rhythm, a cautious dance of reform and resistance. Officers adjusted to the cameras, their movements stiffer, their words more guarded. Meetings ran longer, filled with debates over procedure and accountability that left everyone drained, but strangely invigorated. Sam watched it all unfold, her mind sharp, her resolve unyielding. She knew better than to think the war was won. Daniels, the disgraced captain who'd once ruled this place like a king, had gone silent since his arrest weeks ago. His absence hung over the precinct like a shadow, dark and foreboding, a quiet that felt less like surrender and more like the calm before a tempest. That storm broke late one evening, shattering the fragile stillness Sam had begun to trust. She was alone in her office, the dim glow of her desk lamp casting long shadows across the cluttered space papers stacked high, a cold cup of coffee forgotten in the corner. Her phone buzzed violently against the wood, jolting her from her thoughts. She snatched it up, her heart thudding as Harris's voice crackled through the line, taut with urgency. "Carter, it's Daniels," he said, skipping any preamble. "He's out on bail, and something's happening." Sam's stomach twisted, a cold knot of dread tightening in her gut. "What do you mean, something's happening?" she pressed, her voice sharp, already reaching for her jacket. Harris hesitated, just for a heartbeat, before answering. "He's not laying low. He's rallying his old crew guys still loyal to him. I overheard talk about making a statement, and it doesn't sound good." "Where?" Sam demanded, her mind racing as she strode toward the door. The precinct's fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. "They've been spotted at the old industrial park," Harris replied, his words clipped. "Captain Ramirez is already on his way." Sam didn't waste another second. She bolted for the parking lot, the cool night air hitting her face as she yanked her car door open. Her fingers fumbled with her phone as she dialed Ramirez, the engine roaring to life beneath her. The industrial park loomed ahead as she sped through the empty streets, its skeletal warehouses rising like ghosts against the inky sky. The place was a graveyard of rust and decay. Abandoned machinery littered the cracked pavement, and the wind whistled through broken windows, carrying an eerie, hollow sound. She spotted Ramirez's car parked haphazardly near Warehouse 2, its headlights cutting through the darkness, but there was no sign of him or the backup he'd promised. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she grabbed her radio, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. "Captain, do you copy?" Static hissed back at her, a maddening delay. Before Ramirez's voice broke through, low and urgent, "We're inside Warehouse 2. Daniels has hostages." The word slammed into Sam like a fist, stealing her breath. Hostages. This wasn't just a statement. Daniels was playing for keeps, a desperate, dangerous gambit to claw back the power he'd lost. She approached the warehouse with deliberate caution, her boots silent against the damp concrete, her weapon drawn and steady in her hands. A faint glow spilled from a single bulb inside, flickering weakly, illuminating the cavernous space in patches of light and shadow. She slipped through the rusted door, her eyes scanning every corner. Stacked crates, overturned barrels, the faint drip of water echoing in the distance. Ramirez crouched behind a pile of splintered wooden boxes, his broad shoulders tense, his gun gripped tightly. He motioned her over with a quick jerk of his head, and she knelt beside him, her breath shallow. "Four of them," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the wind outside. "Daniels and 3 others. They've got 2 civilians tied up near the back wall." Sam's jaw tightened, her mind racing as she peered around the crates. She could see them Nautwo figures slumped against the far wall, their wrists bound with coarse rope. One was a middle-aged man, his face pale and slick with sweat, his eyes wide with terror as he tugged uselessly at his restraints. The other was a young woman, barely out of her 20s, her cheeks streaked with tears, her body trembling as she curled into herself. "What's their plan?" Sam asked, her voice a low hiss. Ramirez shook his head, his brow furrowed. "Not clear. But Daniels is making demon charges dropped. Immunity, his badge reinstated." Sam's eyes narrowed, a spark of fury igniting in her chest. "That's not happening," she said flatly. "No, it's not," Ramirez agreed, his tone grim. "But we need to get those hostages out before this blows up." Daniels' voice cut through the warehouse, cold and commanding, dripping with the arrogance Sam had come to despise. "You think this changes anything, Ramirez? You think you can waltz in here and lecture me about rules? You're just like the rest of them, weak, spineless." Sam stepped into view, her gun trained on him, her stance unwavering. Daniels turned to face her, his weathered face twisting into a smirk that made her skin crawl. Carter, always so righteous. How's that working out for you?" His gray eyes glinted with mockery, daring her to flinch. "Don't test me, Daniels," she said, her voice calm, a steel edge beneath it. "This is your last chance to stand down." He chuckled, raising his hands in a mocking surrender, though his gun stayed firmly at his side. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about me. It's about the system you're so desperate to fix. It doesn't want to be fixed, and neither do the people who keep it running." Sam's gaze didn't waver, her resolve hardening with every word he spat. "Then you're as delusional as you are corrupt," she shot back, watching his smirk flicker. Just for a moment, before he glanced at his crew. "Let's show them how things work around here." He snarled. One of his men, a weary figure with a shaved head and a jittery grip, raised his weapon, and the warehouse erupted into chaos. Sand dove behind the crates as bullets ripped through the air, splintering wood and pinging off metal. Ramirez returned fire, his shots precise, keeping Daniels' men pinned down. Sam moved fast, circling the side of the warehouse, her boots silent against the grimy floor, her heart pounding but her mind razor-sharp. "Cover me," she shouted to Ramirez, who shifted his position. Drawing the gunmen's attention with a barrage of shots, she darted toward the hostages, her eyes flicking between Daniels and his crew. The middle-aged man caught her gaze, his desperation palpable as he strained against the ropes. "I've got you," she whispered, her knife slicing through the bindings with swift, practice cuts. She gestured for him to stay low, then turned to the young woman, whose sobs had quieted into shallow, ragged breaths. Sam freed her hands, her touch gentle but urgent, whispering, "Stay down, okay? We're getting you out." Daniels' voice boomed again, cutting through the gunfire. "Don't even think about it, Carter." She spun to face him, her gun snapping up as he aimed his own directly at her, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Drop it, Daniels," she said, her voice steady, unshaken even as her pulse thundered in her ears. "You first," he sneered, his smirk returning, a predator toying with its prey. The standoff stretched on, seconds bleeding into an eternity, the air thick with tension. Then, from the corner of her eye, Sam saw Harris emerge from the shadows behind Daniels, his weapon raised, his face a mask of determination. "Daniels," Harris shouted, his voice a thunderclap. Daniels faltered, his head turning just an hand that was all Sam needed. She lunged, her body a blur as she knocked the gun from his hand, sending it skittering across the concrete. They grappled, his strength fueled by rage, but Sam's training won out. She twisted his arm, forcing him to the ground, her knee pressing into his back as Harris secured the weapon. "It's over, Daniels," she said, her voice icy, unyielding. Ramirez moved in, cuffs clicking around Daniels' wrists as the chaos subsided. The hostages were escorted out, the man limping slightly, the woman clinging to a blanket an officer draped over her shoulders. Daniels' men were rounded up, their defiance crumbling under the weight of defeat. As Daniels was hauled away, he twisted to glare at Sam one last time, his voice a venomous hiss. "You think you've won. This changes nothing." She didn't reply, her eyes tracking him until he vanished into the back of a patrol car, its red and blue lights slicing through the night. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere buzzed with a tense focus. Ramirez called the team together, his voice steady as he debriefed them, ensuring every moment of the night was documented, every shot fired, every word spoken. When it was over, He pulled Sam aside, his gaze searching her face. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said, his tone carrying a rare warmth. "We did what we had to do," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. He nodded, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "Daniels is done," Sam added, her words a vow. "But the work isn't. Corruption doesn't die with one arrest it hides, waiting for another chance." Ramirez studied her, then gave a slow nod. "You're right. It's a beast that never stops hunting. But tonight, we held the line." The precinct settled into an uneasy quiet after that. Daniels and his loyalists were gone. Internal affairs had swept through with their questions and clipboards, and the reforms Sam had bled for were taking hold slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably. Yet the silence wasn't peace. It was the stillness after a storm, a fragile pause that whispered of battles still lurking on the horizon. Sam stood by the second-floor window, the city sprawling out before her, its lights twinkling like stars against the dark. Eastbridge was hers to protect, a sprawling maze of lives and secrets, and her reflection in the glass stared back, tired, resolute, unbowed. Ramirez joined her, his footsteps soft against the worn carpet, his presence a steady anchor in the stillness. "You've done a lot," he said, his voice measured, thoughtful. Most people would have walked away. Sam turned to face him, her expression unyielding. Walking away wasn't an option. He nodded, folding his arms across his chest, his gaze drifting to the skyline. "Daniels is gone. The reforms are in place, but you know this isn't the end." "I do," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "The system doesn't fix itself overnight. Corruption's still out there, hiding in the cracks, waiting for the right moment to crawl back." Ramirez tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Then why keep fighting?" His question wasn't a challenge, it was genuine, a crack in his usually stoic armor. Sam paused, her thoughts drifting to the hostagist man's terrified eyes, the woman's trembling hands, to the officers who'd begun to nod at her in the halls. However hesitantly, "Because someone has to," she said finally, her voice steady, carrying a quiet fire. "If we don't hold the line, the system will swallow us whole. This precinct, this city, it deserves better. Justice isn't just a word, it's a promise. And every time someone like Daniels abuses their power, they prove why we can't stop." Ramirez studied her for a long moment, then gave a small, approving nod. "You've got guts, Carter. I'll give you that." Later, as the night deepened, Sam stood outside the precinct, the cool air brushing against her skin, the faint glow of the Eastbridge Police Department emblem gleaming under the streetlights. She thought of everything hostility she'd faced, Danielle's threats, the warehouse's suffocating tension. It felt like a lifetime compressed into weeks, a weight that pressed against her chest, but also fueled the pride burning beneath it. She'd stood her ground, unyielding against corruption's pull. And though the system was still flawed, it was shifting toward accountability, toward something better. A young officer passed her, his uniform crisp, his nod hesitant but real. Sam returned it, a silent acknowledgement of the fight they shared. The lesson was clear: power unchecked was a poison, and justice was the antidote to fragile, hard-won cure she'd defend as long as she could stand. As the first rays of sunlight crept over the treetops, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, the streets of Oakwood Heights stirred awake. This was no ordinary neighborhood, it was a bastion of wealth and privilege, where every house boasted flawless white picket fences, lawns trimmed to perfection, and luxury cars gleaming in wide, spotless driveways. The air carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass and blooming roses, a quiet symphony of affluence that seemed to whisper, "This is where perfection lives." For Officer James Cooper, however, it was more than just a pretty picture, it was a boundary line, a place where certain people belonged and others didn't. And as he stood at his routine checkpoint that morning, adjusting the stiff collar of his uniform against the crisp dawn air, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was about to cross that line. A sleek black Tesla rolled up to his squad car, its polished surface catching the early light like a mirror. James squinted at it, irritation prickling at the edges of his mind. He couldn't quite place why the car's pristine condition bothered him, but it was too perfect, too out of sync with the gritty reality he was used to policing. The tinted window slid down with a soft hum, revealing a black woman in her mid-30s. She sat poised behind the wheel, her tailored blazer hugging her shoulders, subtle gold jewelry glinting at her neck and ears. Her dark eyes met his with a calm, unflinching confidence that made James's stomach twist. She didn't look nervous, she didn't look out of place, and that, somehow, unsettled him more than anything else. "Good morning, officer," she said, her voice smooth but edged with a firmness that suggested she wasn't here to play games. There was no trace of fear in her tone, no hint of the deference James had come to expect from people at his checkpoints. He didn't return her greeting. Instead, he leaned forward, peering into the car's interior as if it might reveal some hidden secret. His eyes darted over the leather seats, the dashboard, searching for anything a crumpled wrapper, a stray bag that might justify the suspicion coiling in his chest. "License and registration," he snapped, his words sharp and clipped, like a blade slicing through the morning stillness. The woman raised an eyebrow, a flicker of something amusement, maybe, crossing her face. But she didn't argue. "Of course," she replied evenly, reaching for the glove compartment with slow, deliberate movements. Her fingers moved with precision, careful not to startle him, as if she'd rehearsed this moment 100 times before. And she had. Emily Carter knew the stakes of encounters like this, the way a single misstep could turn routine into chaos. She'd felt the weight of eyes like his before, judging, accusing, waiting for her to prove she didn't belong. As she handed over her documents, her heart thudded steadily in her chest, a quiet drumbeat of resolve beneath her composed exterior. James took the papers, his fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting second. He flipped through them slowly, deliberately, his brow furrowing as he scrutinized every line, every number, as if they might confess some hidden crime. "What brings you to this area?" he asked, his voice thick with suspicion. His eyes narrowing as he glanced up at her. Emily paused, her lips parting slightly as she weighed her response. She could feel the undercurrent of his question, the unspoken accusation lurking beneath it. "I'm on my way to a meeting," she said, keeping her tone level, her words measured like stones placed carefully on a scale. "A meeting," James echoed, his voice dripping with mockery. He tilted his head, gesturing toward the manicured streets behind him, the rows of pristine houses glowing in the morning light. "In Oakwood Heights, you know, a lot of crime happens when people are somewhere they shouldn't be." He paused, letting the words hang in the air like a threat. "You don't look like you live around here." His hand shifted slightly, resting on the holster at his hip, a silent reminder of the power he held in this moment. Emily blinked, her breath catching for a fraction of a second. Inside, a storm brewed anger, exhaustion, the sting of being reduced to an outsider in a place she had every right to be. But she swallowed it down, her face a mask of calm. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but edged with steel. James leaned closer, his shadow falling across her window. "You heard me," he shot back, his tone rising, his fingers tightening around the grip of his weapon. "What kind of meeting are you really going to, and whose car is this?" Her chest tightened, a sharp inhale cutting through the silence. Was it rage that burned in her throat, or the bone-deep weariness of facing the same script again and again? She chose her words with care, each one a brick in the wall she built to protect herself. "This is my car," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor threatening to break through. "And the meeting I'm heading to is none of your business." The moment the words left her lips, she knew they'd struck a nerve. James straightened, his jaw clenching so hard she could see the muscles twitch beneath his skin. "None of my business," he repeated, his voice climbing, a dangerous edge creeping into it. "Let me tell you something, ma'am, when I see someone driving a car like this, dressed like you, in a neighborhood like this, it is my business." Emily leaned back in her seat, her expression unreadable, though her mind raced. She could feel the heat of his gaze, the weight of his assumptions pressing down on her like a physical force. "I wasn't aware that professionalism was a crime, officer," she said, her words cool and precise, a quiet defiance woven into every syllable. James stepped back from the car, his boots scuffing against the pavement as he began to circle it. He moved slowly, deliberately, like a hunter stalking prey, his eyes raking over every inch of the vehicle peering through the windows, inspecting the license plate, even crouching to glance underneath as if he might find a smoking gun hidden beneath the chassis. A few early morning joggers slowed their pace, their sneakers squeaking faintly on the asphalt as they cast curious glances her way. A woman with a golden retriever paused, the dog's leash dangling loosely in her hand as she watched the scene unfold. Emily's grip tightened on the steering wheel, her knuckles whitening as the humiliation washed over her in waves. She could feel their eye strangers, neighbors, onlookers boring into her, some with pity, others with judgment. It was a familiar sting, one she'd endured too many times to count, but it never got easier. Still, she refused to let it show. She wouldn't give James the satisfaction of seeing her crack. After what felt like an eternity, he returned to her window, his face a mask of authority. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his voice cutting through the quiet like a whip. Emily's eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief breaking through her composure. "On what grounds?" she asked, her tone sharp despite the tremor in her chest. "I said step out of the car," he repeated, louder this time, his hand hovering near his holster. For a moment, she stared at him, her mind racing, calculating, weighing her options, feeling the injustice of it all like a weight on her shoulders. Then, with a slow, deliberate breath, she complied. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she stepped out, the sound echoing in the still morning air. She stood tall, her shoulders squared, refusing to shrink under his scrutiny. James gestured for her to move to the front of the car, and before she could protest, he began patting her down. His hands moved over her blazer, her pockets, her arms, searching with a roughness that made her skin crawl. "This is completely unnecessary," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "That's not for you to decide," he retorted, his tone cold and final as he rifled through her belongings. Emily clenched her jaw, biting back the flood of words that burned on her tongue, words of anger, of defiance, of every injustice she'd ever faced distilled into this single moment. She knew the game he was playing, the power he wielded like a club, and she knew how easily it could escalate. When he finally stepped back, tossing her documents onto the hood of her car with a careless flick of his wrist, he muttered, "You're clean," as if disappointed by the lack of evidence to justify his actions. She took a deep breath, gathering her papers with hands that shook ever so slightly. Then she met his gaze, her eyes blazing with a quiet, unshakable determination. "For your information, Officer Cooper," she said, her voice clear and unwavering, "I'm on my way to a meeting at the Central Precinct, and if you must know, it's with the Internal Affairs Division." James stiffened, his breath catching as the words sank in. "That's right," she continued, brushing invisible dust from her blazer with a casual grace that belied the fire in her chest. "I'm Emily Carter, the new head of the unit. I'm late for my first day thanks to you." For the first time that morning, James was speechless. His eyes darted from her face to her car, then back to her papers, as if trying to reassemble a puzzle he'd shattered with his own hands. Emily stepped closer, her voice dropping to a low, cutting whisper meant only for him. "You see, Officer Cooper, I've spent my entire career fighting to hold people like you accountable. I know exactly what you were doing just now, and I know exactly why you did it. But don't worry," she added, a faint, bitter smile tugging at her lips. "You'll be seeing more of me soon." With that, she slid back into her car, the door closing with a soft thud that echoed like a gavel strike. The engine purred to life, and she drove off, leaving James standing alone in the middle of the street, his face pale, his heart hammering in his chest. He stumbled back to his squad car, the world around him blurring as the weight of what he'd done began to settle in. His partner, Officer Ryan, leaned over from the passenger seat, his brow furrowed with concern. "Hey, you okay? Who was that?" he asked, his voice cutting through the fog in James's mind. James didn't answer right away. His hands fumbled with the dashboard computer, logging in with shaky fingers as he typed her name into the system. When her profile appeared on the screen, Emily Carter, head of Internal Affairs' stomach dropped. Ryan let out a low whistle, leaning back in his seat. While he muttered, a wry edge to his voice, "You just picked the wrong woman to mess with." James swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. His mind replayed every moment the way he'd barked at her, circled her car. humiliated her in front of strangers, now a noose tightening around his neck. "She's going to bury me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. Ryan raised an eyebrow, but James didn't meet his gaze. He just stared out the windshield, the pristine streets of Oakwood Heights stretching out before him like a mockery of his unraveling world. Meanwhile, across town, the precinct buzzed with a different kind of energy. Officers moved through the halls with purpose, their footsteps echoing off the linoleum floors, their conversations quieter, less guarded than they'd once been. The tension that had long defined this Placia simmering mistrust, a culture of silence, was beginning to erode, replaced by something tentative, something new. Samantha-Sam Carterno relation to Emily, though their paths would soon intertwinesce at her desk, her fingers tracing the edges of a fresh stack of reports. The morning light streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the cluttered surface, illuminating the lines of exhaustion etched into her face. She'd been up late again, poring over files, chasing leads, fighting a battle that felt endless. But this morning, as she flipped through the pages, she noticed something different, a shift in the air, a subtle change in the rhythm of the precinct. The reforms she'd pushed for weren't just words on paper, they were taking root, reshaping the culture inch by painstaking inch. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was progress, and that was enough to keep her going. Officer Harris approached her desk, his broad frame casting a shadow over her work. He dropped a file in front of her with a thud, his gruff voice cutting through her thoughts. "Got something for you," he said, his tone clipped but not unfriendly. Sam glanced up, offering a small nod. "Thanks," she replied, pulling the file closer and flipping it open. The pages rustled under her fingers, each one a thread in the tangled web she was determined to unravel. Harris lingered for a moment, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, as if wrestling with something he wasn't sure how to say. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Not everyone will admit it," he muttered, his eyes flicking away briefly before meeting hers again. "But what you did mattered." Sam paused, her pen hovering over the page. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and saw something rare in his expression: respect, grudging but genuine. "That's the idea," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Harris smirked, a faint crack in his usual stoic facade. "Well, don't get too comfortable," he added, jerking his head toward the bustling precinct behind him. "There's always another mess waiting around the corner." Sam's lips curved into a faint smile, a flicker of warmth breaking through her fatigue. "I'll be ready," she said, and she meant it. As the day drew to a close, Sam found herself standing outside the precinct, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, and she watched as the city's lights began to flicker on, one by one. Her mind drifted to the long road ahead, to the resistance she'd faced, to the small victories she'd clawed from the jaws of a broken system. The fight for justice was a marathon, not a sprint, and she knew it was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of hope, a fragile, stubborn belief that change was possible, that the tide could turn if she kept pushing forward. Her thoughts churned, circling a question that gnawed at her in quiet moments like this. If someone else stood in her shoes, faced with the same odds, the same cost, would they fight? Would they stand against a system so deeply entrenched, knowing the price it demanded? For Sam, the answer was as clear as the city skyline stretching out before her. She turned back toward the precinct, her steps steady, her resolve a fire that refused to be extinguished. Whatever came next, she was ready. Across town, Emily Carter pulled into the precinct parking lot, her Tesla humming softly as she cut the engine. Her encounter with James still lingered in her mind, a bitter taste she couldn't quite shake. But as she stepped out of the car, smoothing her blazer and squaring her shoulders, she felt a surge of purpose. She'd spent years building a career on accountability, on rooting out the rot that festered in places like this. And now, as the new head of internal affairs, she had the power to do something about it, to ensure that men like James faced the consequences of their actions, that justice wasn't just a word but a reckoning. Back at the checkpoint, James sat slumped in his squad car, the silence between him and Ryan thick with unspoken tension. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him, heavy and unrelenting. He'd abused his authority, let prejudice guide his hands, and now the consequences were barreling toward him like a freight train. Ryan watched him from the corner of his eye, his fingers drumming idly on the armrest. "You think she'll come after you?" he asked, his voice casual but laced with curiosity. James didn't answer right away. He just stared out at the empty street, the pristine facade of Oakwood Heights mocking him with its serenity. "She doesn't have to," he said finally, his voice hollow. "She's already won." In that moment, the lesson crystallized for him. Power, unchecked, was a double-edged sword. It could protect, it could serve, but when wielded carelessly, it cut deepest the one holding it. For Emily and Sam, it was a different lesson. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed from above. It was a fire forged in the crucible of courage, a flame they'd tend with every step, every fight, until the world bent toward something better. For years, the seasoned officer had carried himself with a steady, unshakable confidence, his broad shoulders squared against the world. But now, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, a shiver of dread crept up his spine. It wasn't just the chill of the early morning air seeping through the precinct windows. It was something deeper, something primal, fear, a sensation so foreign it rattled him to his core. As he sat at his cluttered desk, surrounded by the familiar chaos of ringing phones and clattering keyboards, he couldn't shake the gnawing question looping through his mind. Did he truly deserve the reckoning that loomed on the horizon? The next morning, James woke with a heaviness in his chest, a tightening knot of anxiety that refused to loosen. He dragged himself to the station, his boots scuffing against the cracked pavement as he approached the squat, gray building he'd called a second home for over a decade. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with an unusual energy. Officers milled about in tight-knit groups, their voices low and urgent, like bees swarming a hive. Whispers darted through the air, sharp and fleeting, carrying fragments of a name that sent a jolt through James's already frayed nerves. Emily Carter, the new head of internal affairs. No one knew much about her yet, but the rumors were already spinning wild tales. "She's tough as nails," one officer muttered near the coffee machine, his tone a mix of awe and unease. "Heard she doesn't let anything slide," another chimed in, shaking his head as he stirred sugar into his mug. James stood rooted to his spot by his desk, his ears burning as the snippets of conversation pierced through the hum of the room. Each word landed like a hammer strike, driving nails into a coffin he could practically see carved with his name. His thoughts spiraled back to the day before, replaying the encounter that had set this nightmare in motion. He could still hear her voice, calm, measured, yet edged with a sharpness that cut deeper than any shout. He could still see the subtle disdain flickering in her eyes, a quiet storm brewing beneath her composed exterior. He'd been blindsided, caught utterly off guard by her presence at the checkpoint, and now the consequences were barreling toward him like a runaway train. He'd barked orders, let his temper flare, and humiliated her in front of a crowd of onlookers, neighbors who'd watch with wide eyes and hushed gasps. And now, she wasn't just some random civilian. She was his boss. "Hey, Cooper," the voice snapped him out of his reverie, and James flinched, his heart lurching. Officer Ryan, a lanky figure with a mop of sandy hair, materialized beside him, clutching a steaming mug of coffee that sent tendrils of warmth into the air. "You look like you've seen a ghost, man." Still stewing over yesterday, James didn't respond immediately. His eyes drifted to the computer screen in front of him, where he'd been pretending to sift through reports, the cursor blinking idly on a half-finished sentence. Ryan took a slow sip, the ceramic clinking against his teeth, then leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Look, maybe it's not as bad as you think. She doesn't strike me as the vindictive type. Just say you're sorry. Play it cool, she might let it slide." James let out a bitter, hollow laugh that echoed faintly in the cramped space. "Let it slide, Ryan. I humiliated her in front of half the damn neighborhood, and now she's running internal affairs. You think she's just gonna brush that off?" His fingers tightened around the edge of his desk, knuckles whitening. Ryan shrugged, unfazed, swirling the coffee in his mug. "I mean, technically, she can't come after you just for that. There's procedure, right? Rules she's gotta follow." James shook his head, his voice dropping to a mutter. "Procedure, sure. You think I don't know how this game works? I've seen you tear guys apart for less than what I pulled. They don't play fair, they never have. Ryan opened his mouth to argue, but the words died on his lips as a sudden stillness swept through the precinct. The chatter faded, replaced by the soft shuffle of boots and the creak of chairs as every head turned toward the entrance. Emily Carter stepped into the room, and the air itself seemed to shift under the weight of her presence. She was striking and poised, her navy blazer hugging her frame with crisp precision, her stride exuding a quiet, unshakable authority. A leather folder was tucked under her arm, its edges worn but pristine, and her face was a mask of calm unreadable, yet commanding. The officers straightened instinctively, some smoothing wrinkled uniforms, others clutching their coffee mugs a little tighter. James felt his throat close up, a lump forming as he shrank into his chair, wishing he could melt into the faded linoleum floor. Her gaze swept the room, sharp and deliberate, taking in every face with the precision of a hawk circling its prey. When her eyes landed on James, they lingered edges for a heartbeat, a fleeting pause that felt like an eternity. He saw it, a flicker of recognition, a silent acknowledgement that sent a chill racing down his spine. Then, as quickly as it came, her attention shifted and she addressed the room. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice steady and firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. "My name is Emily Carter, and as you've likely heard, I'm the new head of internal affairs. I won't take much of your time today, but I wanted to introduce myself and lay out a few ground rules." The officers exchanged wary glances, their shoulders stiffening as she paced slowly, her heels clicking against the tiled floor with a rhythm that felt almost hypnotic. "My job," she continued, her tone unwavering, "is to ensure this department runs with integrity, accountability, and fairness. I'm not here to make friends, and I'm not here to start fights. I'm here to do what's right for this department, for the community, and for the badge we all wear." Her words hung heavy in the air, a challenge wrapped in a promise. No one dared to breathe too loudly, let alone interrupt. She stopped in the center of the room, her posture relaxed yet radiating power. "I know there's tension between internal affairs and the rest of you," she admitted, her eyes scanning the faces before her. "I know some of you might see me as the enemy, but let me be clear, I don't want to be your enemy. I want to work with you, not against you." Her gaze drifted again, brushing over James for a split second before moving on. "That said, if you step out of line, if you abuse your power, if you think you're above the law, you'll find out very quickly that I'm not someone to underestimate." James's palms grew slick with sweat, his pulse hammering in his ears. Her words weren't aimed at him directly, but they sliced through him all the same, each syllable a reminder of his recklessness, his arrogance. "Any questions?" she asked, raising a single eyebrow. The room remained silent, the officers frozen in their seats. "Good," she said, her tone softening just a touch. "I look forward to working with all of you. My office is upstairs if you need me." With that, she turned and strode toward the staircase, her heels echoing in the stillness until she disappeared from view. The moment she was gone, the precinct erupted into a flurry of hushed voices, a dam breaking under the pressure of pent-up nerves. James slumped back in his chair, his chest tight, his heart thudding against his ribs. He knew it was only a matter of time before she summoned him. And sure enough, less than 10 minutes later, his computer pinged with a new email. He stared at the screen, his stomach plummeting as he read the subject line, "Meeting request from Emily Carter. To James Cooper, time, 3 p.m. location, Internal Affairs Office." Ryan leaned over his shoulder, peering at the message with a low whistle. 3 o'clock, huh? She doesn't mess around. James groaned, dragging a hand through his hair, the strands damp with sweat. "What the hell am I supposed to say to her?" Ryan shrugged again, his casual demeanor maddeningly unhelpful. "Be honest, man, own up to it. You messed up, but maybe she'll respect you more if you admit it." James wasn't convinced. Respect. From her, after what he'd done, it felt like grasping at straws in a hurricane. At 3 o'clock sharp, James stood before the door to Emily's office, his fist hovering over the wood as his pulse raced. He knocked, the sound weak and tentative. "Comin'," her voice called from within, cool and composed. He stepped inside. the air thick with the scent of polished wood and fresh paper. She sat behind a sleek desk, her leather folder open before her, a pen poised in her hand as she finished a note. She didn't look up immediately, letting the silence stretch until it pressed against his chest. "Officer Cooper," she said at last, gesturing to the chair across from her. He sat, his mouth dry as sand, his hands clenched in his lap. She leaned back, folding her hands with deliberate care, and studied him. Her expression was a blank slate, her eyes piercing yet impossibly distant. James shifted uncomfortably, fighting the urge to fill the silence with excuses. "Do you know why you're here?" she asked, her voice low but firm. "Yes, ma'am," he croaked, his throat tight. She raised an eyebrow, a subtle challenge. "Do you?" He hesitated, the weight of her gaze pinning him in place. "It's about yesterday, at the checkpoint," she said, answering for him. She opened her folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. "This is your incident report. I want you to read it, out loud." His stomach twisted into a knot, bile rising in his throat. "Out loud," he echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," she replied, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. With trembling hands, he picked up the report, the paper crinkling under his grip. He began to read, each word a jagged stone in his mouth. "Stopped a black female driver in Oakwood Heights. Vehicle, Tesla Model S driver appeared out of place." He faltered, the shame burning his cheeks, but her steady gaze urged him on. He forced himself to continue, the report laying bare every assumption, every snap judgment, every trace of bias he'd let spill onto the page. When he finished, he looked up, his face flushed, his breath shallow. "Do you know what this reads like, Officer Cooper?" she asked, her voice cutting through the haze. He shook his head, unable to form words. "It reads like prejudice," she said bluntly, leaning forward. "It reads like someone who judges people based on how they look, not what they do. Do you understand what that means?" "Yes, ma'am," he whispered, the sound barely audible. She held his gaze for a long, excruciating moment before nodding. "Good. Because this isn't just about me. It's about every person you've ever stopped, every life you've touched, every choice you've made with that badge on your chest." Her words crashed over him like a tidal wave, heavy with the weight of justice and consequence. The badge he'd worn with pride now felt like a brand of guilt. "This isn't over," she said, closing her folder with a soft thud. "You'll hear from me soon." And with that, the meeting ended, leaving James adrift in a sea of his own regrets. Later, he sat in the precinct break room, staring at an untouched sandwich on the table before him. The space hummed with the usual clamor, officers laughing, vending machines whirring, but it all blurred into a dull roar. His mind was elsewhere, trapped in the echo of Emily's voice, the storm of scrutiny gathering around him. The precinct buzzed with speculation about her rival, the once easy banter replaced by cautious murmurs behind closed doors. Every glance his way felt like a spotlight, a silent judgment of the man he'd been and the man he might never become again. "Hey, Cooper," Ryan's voice cut through the fog, warm and familiar. He slid into the chair opposite James, his eyes crinkling with a mix of concern and curiosity. "You holding up okay?" James didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the sandwich as if it held the answers he couldn't find. Ryan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Look, man, she's tough, but she's fair. You've got a shot to make this right. Don't let it eat you alive." For the first time, James met his friend's eyes, seeing not just pity, but a glimmer of hope, a reminder that justice, though harsh, could also be a path to redemption. But deep down, he knew the lesson Emily Carter embodied. Power abused carried a price, and he was only beginning to pay it. The air in the dimly lit diner felt thick with tension. As Ryan leaned across the scratched wooden table, his voice dropping to a hushed, almost conspiratorial tone. "You look like hell, man," he said, his eyes scanning James's haggard face, pale skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, dark circles carving hollows beneath bloodshot eyes. James didn't bother to reply. His fingers fidgeted with the frayed edge of his sandwich wrapper, peeling it back bit by bit as if unraveling it might somehow untangle the mess inside his head. He kept his gaze fixed downward, avoiding the weight of Ryan's stare, the unspoken questions hanging between them like a storm cloud ready to burst. Ryan shifted in his seat, the vinyl cushion squeaking under his weight, and leaned in closer, resting his elbows on the table. "Look, I get it," he said, his tone softening but still edged with urgency. "She's coming down on you like a ton of bricks, but maybe just maybe this is your shot." His words lingered, heavy with implication, as if he were tossing James a lifeline he wasn't sure his friend would grab. James's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with a sudden spark of defiance. "My shot at what?" He shot back, his voice rough and jagged, like gravel grinding underfoot. "To redeem myself, to convince her I'm not some racist bastard. What the hell am I supposed to do? Ryan, rewrite history?" His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, betraying the frustration simmering just beneath his brittle exterior. Ryan let out a slow, weary sigh, running a hand through his tousled hair. "You messed up, James. We've all messed up at some point. But sitting here, drowning in your own misery, picking at that damn rapper like it's gonna fix anything, it's not helping. You're gonna have to face her again, and when you do, you'd better figure out how to own it." His words weren't cruel, but they cut deep, each one landing like a stone in the pit of James's stomach. James opened his mouth, a sharp retort poised on his tongue, but the words died in his throat as the diner door swung open with a jarring creak. Officer Alvarez stepped inside, her boots clicking sharply against the tiled floor. She clutched a clipboard in her hands, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable save for the faint tightness around her mouth. "Cooper," she barked, her voice clipped and cold, slicing through the hum of the diner like a blade. "You're needed upstairs, now." James felt his stomach lurch, a cold wave of dread washing over him. He glanced at Ryan, who offered a fleeting, sympathetic look, lips pressed into a thin line, eyes softening for just a moment, but James turned away, unwilling to accept the pity. He shoved himself to his feet, his legs heavy as if they were encased in cement, and followed Alvarez out the door. Each step echoed in his ears, a slow, reluctant march toward whatever awaited him. The hallway leading to Emily's office felt like a gauntlet, the sterile white walls closing in around him as he trailed behind Alvarez. Her silence was deafening, her brisk pace a stark contrast to the sluggish drag of his own boots against the linoleum. When they reached the door, Alvarez stepped aside with a curt nod, leaving James alone to face the threshold. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the knob, before pushing it open and stepping into the frigid air of Emily's domain. The office was a study in precision, every folder on her desk meticulously aligned, the fluorescent lights overhead casting a stark, unforgiving glare across the polished wood. Emily sat behind the desk, her head bent over a report, her pen moving with deliberate strokes as she annotated the margins. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge James's presence as he stood before her, his hands clasped tightly behind his back like a soldier braced for reprimand. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, each tick of the clock on the wall amplifying the knot of anxiety twisting in his gut. Finally, Emily set the report aside with a quiet rustle of paper and lifted her gaze to meet his. Her expression was a mask of neutrality, but her eye sharp and unyielding pierced through him, stripping away any pretense he might have clung to. "Officer Cooper," she began, her voice calm but laced with an authority that made his spine stiffen. She folded her hands on the desk, fingers interlocking with a quiet grace. "I assume you know why you're here." "Yes, ma'am," James replied, forcing his voice to remain steady even as his insides churned. The word felt hollow, a thin shield against the storm he knew was coming. Emily tilted her head slightly, studying him with the precision of a surgeon about to make an incision. "Are you?" she asked, her tone deceptively mild. James faltered, uncertainty creeping into his resolve. "Because of my conduct during the traffic stop," he said slowly, each word chosen with care, as if navigating a minefield. She nodded, a slow, deliberate motion that carried more weight than words. "That's part of it," she said, her voice hardening. "But it's not just the traffic stop, Officer Cooper. It's about a pattern, a thread that runs through your entire record." She reached for a folder, flipping it open with a flick of her wrist, and slid a single sheet of paper across the desk toward him. "I've reviewed your history. Do you know how many complaints of racial bias have been filed against you in the past 5 years?" James's throat tightened, his mouth going dry as he glanced at the document. The words blurred before his eyes, refusing to settle into focus. He couldn't bring himself to read it, couldn't face the stark reality laid bare in black ink. 7, Emily said, her voice cutting through his silence like a blade. 7 complaints. Do you know how many were formally investigated? He shook his head, his voice abandoning him entirely, leaving him mute and exposed. 2, she continued, unrelenting. The others were dismissed lack of evidence, they said. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that made his skin prickle. But do you know what I see when I look at this? I see a pattern of prejudice, of profiling, of abusing the power entrusted to you. And yesterday, you added yet another mark to that ledger. James's fists clenched at his sides, his nails digging into his palms as he fought to keep his composure. With all due respect, ma'am, he said, his voice low and strained. I've always done my job by the book. Emily's eyebrow arched, a subtle but scathing rebuke. By the book, she repeated, her tone dripping with disbelief. Is that what you call pulling over a black woman in a luxury car, searching her without cause, humiliating her in front of a crowd? Is that your definition of good policing? Her words hung in the air, sharp and accusatory, leaving no room for retreat. James opened his mouth to respond, but the defense he'd rehearsed in his mind crumbled to ash. He had no answer, no justification that could stand against the truth in her eyes. Emily leaned back in her chair, letting the silence settle like a judge's gavel. Do you know why I joined Internal Affairs, Officer Cooper? She asked, her voice softening just enough to catch him off guard. He shook his head, unsure where she was leading him, his stomach twisting with a fresh wave of unease. Emily's gaze drifted for a moment, as if peering into a memory she rarely revisited. I have a younger brother, she said, her tone warming slightly, though the steel beneath it remained. Marcus. Smart kid, big heart, always wanted to change the world. A faint smile flickered across her lips, tender and fleeting, before it vanished. A few years ago, Marcus was arrested, accused of stealing a Cara car he was driving because he worked as a valet for the owner. James's gut twisted painfully, a sickening realization dawning as she spoke. He tried to explain. Emily went on, her voice growing colder, but the officers wouldn't listen. They saw a young black man behind the wheel of a Mercedes, and that was enough for them. They assumed he was a thief, a criminal. He spent 2 nights in jail before the truth came out. By then, the damage was Donaghy's trust in the system, his sense of safety, all shattered. Her eyes locked onto his again, hard and unyielding. Do you have any idea what it's like to watch someone you love be reduced to a stereotype? To see them lose faith in a system that's supposed to protect them? All because of someone's careless assumptions. James couldn't meet her gaze, his head dipping as shame burned through him. That's why I'm here, Officer Cooper, she said, her voice resolute. To make sure what happened to Marcus doesn't happen to anyone else. To hold officers like you accountable when you abuse your power and cross that line. Her words struck him like a physical blow, reverberating through his chest and leaving him breathless. He wanted to argue, to insist he wasn't the villain she painted him to be, but a quiet, nagging voice deep within whispered that she was right. He started, his voice cracking. I didn't mean. Intentions don't matter, Emily cut in, her tone sharp and final. Impact does. Your actions have consequences, Officer Cooper, not just for the people you target, but for everyone. Every time you wield your authority like a weapon, you erode the trust the public has in us. You make it harder for every good officer out there to do their job. She paused, studying him with a mix of disappointment and expectation. You're on administrative leave, effective immediately. During that time, you'll attend mandatory training on racial bias and ethics in policing. When you return, your performance will be under a microscope. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am, James muttered, the words barely audible as numbness seeped into his bones. Emily closed the folder with a decisive snap and set it aside. You're dismissed. James turned to leave, his hand on the doorknob, but something stopped him. He glanced back at her, his voice barely above a whisper. Chief Carter, I'm sorry. For everything. She didn't respond immediately, her silence stretching out like a judgment. When she finally spoke, Her voice was steady but firm. "Don't apologize to me, Officer Cooper. Apologize to the people you've wronged, and then do better." He nodded once, a jerky motion, and slipped out of the office, her words trailing after him like a shadow he couldn't shake. Days later, James found himself in a cramped, windowless room on the second floor of the city's police academy. The chairs were hard and unforgiving, digging into his back as he sat stiffly among a handful of other officers. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sickly glow over the bare walls, and the air carried the stale, bitter scent of old coffee. At the front of the room stood a Trinera middle-aged man with a calm, steady presence, his badge identifying him as a consultant from a national policing reform group. He gripped a marker in his hand, scrawling the words "implicit bias" in bold, uneven letters across a whiteboard. James's jaw tightened as he stared at the phrase, the letters seeming to pulse with accusation. This was day one of his mandatory training, a grueling series of sessions on ethics, bias, and community policing, what Emily had called his path to accountability. He shifted in his seat, the plastic creaking beneath him, feeling like an outsider among the others. Their eyes seemed to bore into him, judging him, though he couldn't tell if it was real or just the paranoia gnawing at his mind. Sleep had eluded him since that meeting with Emily, her voice echoing in his head, her story about Marcus cutting deeper with every restless night. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of something unfamiliar, guilt, perhaps, or the beginnings of regret. "All right," the trainer said, his voice smooth but commanding as he turned to face the group. "Let's start with something simple. What comes to mind when you hear the word bias?" The room fell silent, the officers exchanging uneasy glances, their discomfort palpable. No one wanted to be the first to speak, to bear their thoughts in this sterile, judgmental space. James crossed his arms over his chest, his gaze dropping to the scuffed table in front of him, his mind racing. Finally, a younger officer, a weary man with nervous hands and a faint stutter, broke the silence. "I guess it's when you judge someone unfairly," he said, his voice tentative, as if testing the waters. The trainer nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "That's a solid start." He turned back to the whiteboard, adding the word judgment beneath implicit bias. Bias is about how we perceive the world, how we interpret people, situations, everything. It's not always something we're aware of, but it shapes our choices in ways we don't even notice. He faced the group again, his eyes sweeping over them with quiet intensity. "Now, let's get uncomfortable. Who here has ever made an assumption about someone based on their appearance of the race, their clothes, where they're from?" The question landed like a thunderclap, reverberating through the room. James felt his chest constrict, his instinct screaming at him to look away, to deny it, to build a wall of excuses. But Emily's face flashed in his mind, her calm, piercing words. The pain she'd carried for her brother, and his hand rose, slow and reluctant, trembling slightly in the air. The trainer's eyes met his, and he nodded, a silent acknowledgement that carried more weight than James had expected. The air in the training room felt heavy, thick with tension, as Officer James Cooper raised his hand, his fingers trembling slightly against the fabric of his uniform. A few others followed his lead, their hands creeping upward like cautious flags in a storm. Though most of the officers kept their arms locked at their sides, their faces unreadable masks of defiance or indifference, the trainer, a weary man with sharp eyes and a voice that cut through the silence, pressed forward without hesitation. "Think about it," he urged, pacing the front of the room, his boots clicking against the linoleum floor. "Think about how those snap judgments you make ripple outward, how they crash into the lives of the people you encounter, how they twist your ability to uphold the law with fairness and clarity." James's mind churned, a chaotic swirl of memories flooding in uninvited. He saw the young man he'd pulled over late one night, the kid's beat-up sedan creaking as it rolled through a neighborhood of manicured lawns, and gleaming subs. James had told himself the car didn't belong there, that it was suspicious. He remembered the woman outside the convenience store, her jittery hands fumbling with her purse as he demanded to search her, her nervous glances feeding his certainty that she was hiding something. And then there was Emily Carter. The name alone sent a jolt through him, a bitter taste rising in his throat. He swallowed hard, the weight of those moments piling onto his chest like stones, each one heavier than the last. For years, he'd convinced himself he was just doing his job, protecting the city, keeping order. But now, doubt gnawed at him, sharp and relentless, whispering that maybe he'd been wrong all along. Over the next few days, the training sessions became a crucible, forging something new and uncomfortable within him. It wasn't the material itself that wore him down. Lectures on policy and procedure were dry, but manageability was the mirror they held up to his soul, forcing him to confront truths he'd buried deep. One exercise in particular struck him like a thunderclap. The trainer passed out photographs, a stack of glossy images depicting people from all walks of life, different races, ages, styles of dress. Write down your first thought, the trainer instructed, his tone calm but firm. James's eyes locked onto the photo, in his hands a black teenager in a hoodie, headphones slung lazily around his neck, hands jammed into his pockets. The word flashed in his mind before he could stop it: trouble. His pen hovered over the paper, his stomach twisting as shame crept up his spine. He scribbled it down anyway, the ink bleeding slightly as his hand pressed too hard. When the trainer called on the group to share, James felt the room shrink around him. His turn came, and he hesitated, his tongue thick in his mouth. "I wrote trouble," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. Rough with the effort of honesty, the trainer didn't flinch, didn't scold. Instead, he tilted his head, his gaze steady and piercing. "Thank you for that, Officer Cooper. Now tell me, you had in that picture says trouble to you." James stared at the photo again, his mind scrambling for an answer. The kid's posture, the hoodie, the way his hands disappeared into his pockets. I don't know," he admitted finally, the words tasting like defeat. "Exactly," the trainer replied, his voice cutting through the haze. "That judgment doesn't come from the image. It comes from the assumptions you've carried with you, built up over time. That's what we're here to unravel." The realization hit James hard, a brutal punch to his core. For the first time, he saw how deeply those biases had rooted themselves in him, how they'd silently guided his every move as an officer, masquerading as instinct. Outside the training, James's mandatory leave stretched before him like an endless road, giving him too much time to think. He'd spent for years on the force, chest puffed with pride at being the tough cop who got results, the one who didn't flinch when the job got messy. Now, that pride felt hollow. One evening, alone in his cramped apartment, the hum of the refrigerator his only company, he cracked open his laptop. His fingers hovered over the keys, uncertain. Before they began to move, the words came haltingly at first, each one a struggle. But soon they spilled out like water breaking through a dam. "Dear Chief Carter," he typed, his breath catching as he pictured her stern face, her unwavering resolve. "I don't know if you'll even see this, but I have to get it off my chest. I owe you an apology, not just for how I treated you, but for what that moment stands for. I spent years telling myself I was keeping the city safe, that my decisions were justified. But the truth is, I let my own warped lens decide who was guilty before they even opened their mouth. I called it good policing, but it was lazy, it was wrong. You saw through me when I couldn't see myself. My actions didn't just hurt people, they chipped away at the trust we're supposed to build with the community. I can't erase the damage, but I'm trying to be better. This training has ripped me open, forced me to face things I've dodged for too long. I'm thankful for it. And for you for not letting me off the hook when it would have been easier to give up on me. I don't expect you to forgive me. I haven't earned it. But I'm in this now, not just for me, but for the people I swore to protect. Thank you for giving me a shot at redemption. Sincerely, James Cooper. He stared at the screen, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat before he hit send. His chest tightened with a mix of dread and relief. Would Emily read it? Would she care? He didn't know, but for once, he felt like he was moving forward, even if the path was shaky. Weeks later, James stood outside the community center, his hands buried in his jacket pockets, the wind tugging at his collar. The place buzzed with life. Families trickled in for workshops, their voices mingling with the shouts of kids darting across the courtyard, chasing each other in a blur of laughter. Volunteers hauled crates of canned goods and fresh produce, their faces flushed with purpose. James had never pictured himself in a place like this, surrounded by people he'd once sized up from behind a badge. But here he was, 6 weeks into his leave, attending yet another bias training session. Each one had been a slow grind, peeling back layers of himself he'd rather keep hidden. The trainers didn't soften their words. They spoke of systemic racism, of the quiet poison of unchecked assumptions, of the wreckage left behind when power was wielded carelessly. It was like standing in front of a cracked mirror, the reflection jagged and unfamiliar. Inside, he spotted his fellow officers, their arms folded tight, their eyes wary. He knew that look had worn at himself in the beginning, bristling at every critique. But something had shifted. He'd sat through hours of community testimonies, each story a needle under his skin. A teenage boy, voice trembling, described being pinned against a wall for fitting the description of a shoplifter. James saw the kid's clenched fists, the fear masked as anger. A mother, her eyes weary, explained how she drilled her son to keep his hands out, his tone soft, every time he left the house, just in case. An older man, his shoulders slumped, recounted 3 years lost to a prison cell for a crime he didn't commit. His life unraveling while James and his colleagues moved on. These weren't faceless problems anymore, they were people, their voices echoing in his head long after the sessions ended. When James returned to the force, his reinstatement came with strings, every move watched. His record a tightrope, but the real pressure wasn't from his superiors. It was in the sideways glances from his peers. Ryan, his old partner, hovered awkwardly now, unsure how to bridge the gap between the James he'd known and the one standing there, quieter, more guarded. Some officers pitied him, their whispers tinged with condescension, while others sneered, their muttered jabs about woke nonsense trailing him down the halls. James didn't fight back. He didn't have it in him. Instead, he threw himself into the real job. He signed up for community outreach, sitting with local leaders over chipped mugs of coffee, listening as they laid out their frustrations, their hopes. He joined a mentorship program, spending weekends on a cracked basketball court, teaching kids jump shots and helping them wrestle with algebra homework. At first, the parents eyed him warily, the kids testing him with sharp tongues and folded arms. But he kept showing up in a badge, no ultimatums, and slowly, some of those barriers softened. It was at one of these events, a book drive, the air thick with the smell of old pages and fresh paint, that he saw Emily again. She slipped in quietly, her slacks and blouse unassuming, her presence almost lost in the crowd. James was knee-deep in a pile of paperbacks, guiding a gaggle of kids as they sorted titles into wobbly stacks. When he caught sight of her near the entrance, chatting with a volunteer, his hands stilled, the book in his grip forgotten. He hadn't spoken to her since that tense meeting in her office, her words still ringing in his ears. He'd thought about reaching out, drafting letters he never sent, each one crumbling under the fear that it'd sound empty. Now she was here, and he couldn't duck away fast enough. She approached before he could retreat, her stride steady, her face composed but not cold. "Officer Cooper," she said, her voice carrying that familiar authority. "Chief Carter," he replied, straightening instinctively, his throat dry. Her gaze flicked to the kids behind him, their chatter a soft hum against the moment. "Looks like you've been busy," she observed, her tone measured. "Yes, Mum," he said, clearing his throat. "It's the mentorship program. We help with stuff like this on weekends." She nodded, her eyes sweeping the room, taking in the bustle. "It's good work, important work." James shifted, the weight of her presence pressing against him. He couldn't let the moment slip by. "Chief Carter," he started, his voice faltering, "I've been meaning to say thank you for holding me accountable, for giving me a chance to figure this out." She studied him, her expression easing just enough to let something human peek through. "Change isn't easy, Officer Cooper," she said, her words deliberate. "It takes work, real work." He nodded, the lesson sinking deeper. Justice wasn't just about catching the guilty. It was about owning the consequences when power tipped too far. For the first time, he felt the full heft of that truth, and it steadied him. James stood in the dim light of the precinct's break room, the faint hum of a flickering fluorescent bulb buzzing overhead, like a persistent reminder of his own unease. His hands fidgeted with the edge of his coffee mug, the ceramic cool against his palms as he replayed the conversation in his mind. Humility and a willingness to listen. You've taken the first steps, but the work doesn't stop here, he had said to Emily, his voice quieter than usual, almost tentative. He could feel the weight of his own admission hanging in the air, thick and heavy like the stale scent of burnt coffee that clung to the room. I know, he added quickly, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. And I'm not pretending I've suddenly turned everything around. I need you to see that I'm trying. I'm really trying to be better. Across from him, Emily stood with her arms crossed, her sharp hazel eyes studying him as though she could peel back the layers of his words and glimpse the truth beneath. The silence stretched between them, taut and deliberate, as she weighed his sincerity. Her expression was unreadable at first, a mask of scrutiny that made James shift uncomfortably in his boots. Then, slowly, she nodded a small, measured gesture that felt like a lifeline, tossed into the churning sea of his doubt. Good, she said, her tone firm yet laced with an undercurrent of expectation. Because this isn't just about you, Officer Cooper. It's about the community you swore to protect. The people who look to you for safety, for fairness. They deserve more than what you've given them so far. And so do the honest-to-ficest ones who actually live by the oath they took. Her words landed like stones in his chest, each one sinking deeper, stirring a quiet ache of recognition. She wasn't wrong, and that truth gnawed at him as he dipped his head in acknowledgement, unable to meet her gaze for a moment longer. As Emily turned to leave, her boots clicking softly against the linoleum floor, James felt a sudden pang of urgency ripple through him. Chief Carter, he called out, his voice cracking slightly as it broke the stillness. She paused mid-step, her silhouette framed by the doorway, and glanced back at him with a raised brow. He swallowed hard, the apology clawing its way up his throat. I need to say I'm sorry. For what I did, for how I treated you. I know I can't erase it, can't rewind the clock and undo the damage, but I want you to know I regret it. Every bit of it. His hands tightened around the mug, knuckles whitening as he braced himself for her response. Emily's gaze softened then, the hard edges of her demeanor melting just enough for a flicker of warmth to seep through. A faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips, subtle but genuine, like the first crack of dawn breaking through a long night. Regrets a start, Officer Cooper, she said, her voice quieter now, almost reflective. But it's action that matters, action that proves you mean it. Keep pushing forward, keep doing the work. And maybe one day we won't have to stand here having these kinds of talks. She held his gaze for a heartbeat longer, then turned and walked away, her footsteps fading into the hum of the precinct. James stood rooted to the spot, her words echoing in his skull like a mantra he couldn't shake. He watched her disappear around the corner, leaving him alone with the weight of his thoughts. The fluorescent light buzzed louder now, a grating reminder of the long road ahead. He set the mug down on the counter, the clink of ceramic against formica sounding final, resolute. For the first time, he felt the stirrings of something unfamiliar, perhaps, or maybe just the fragile beginnings of accountability. Months later, the air was thick with anticipation as James lingered at the edge of a crowded auditorium. The space buzzed with murmurs and rustling programs, the scent of polished wood and faint perfume wafting through the room. Rows of folding chairs stretched out before him, filled with community members, parents clutching notepads, teenagers slouched in their seats, elderly residents leaning forward with keen interest. Overhead, the fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow, illuminating the stage where Emily now stood. She was a commanding presence, her dark blazer crisp against the muted backdrop, her posture radiating a quiet confidence that seemed to draw every eye in the room. As she stepped up to the podium, the crowd hushed, the air crackling with expectation. James watched her from the sidelines, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his uniform jacket, the fabric worn and familiar against his skin. Emily's voice rang out, clear and steady, as she spoke about trust, about rebuilding bridges between the police and the people they served. Justice isn't just a word, she said, her eyes sweeping the audience with a fierce intensity. It's a promise that power won't be abused, that those who wield it will face consequences when they fail us. Her passion was palpable, a living thing that pulsed through the room. and James felt it settle into his bones. He thought of the officers he'd once idolized, the ones who'd laughed off complaints and bent rules without a second thought. He'd been one of them, hadn't he? Blind to the damage, deaf to the voices crying out for fairness. But now, listening to Emily, he saw it all different: lithe fragility of trust, the cost of arrogance, the slow rot that came from unchecked power. Her speech wove a thread of hope through the crowd, a vision of something better. And James couldn't help but feel it tug at him too. He shifted his weight, the creak of his boots muffled by the carpet, and let her words sink in. They reminded him of how far he'd come, how the rigid, black and white lens he'd once viewed the world through had cracked and splintered over time. He wasn't the same man who'd scoffed at accountability, who'd let pride dictate his actions. But he wasn't finished either. The work stretched out before him like an endless road, winding and steep, demanding patience he hadn't known he possessed. As the event drew to a close, the auditorium erupted in applause, a wave of sound that rolled over James like a tide. Emily stepped down from the stage, shaking hands with a few attendees, a gray-haired woman with a cane, a young man in a hoodie who nodded earnestly at her words. James didn't linger. He slipped out through a side door, the cool night air hitting his face as he stepped into the parking lot. The stars blinked faintly overhead, muted by the glow of streetlights, and the distant hum of traffic filled the silence. He didn't need anyone to notice him, didn't crave the pat on the back or the approving nod. That wasn't what this was about anymore. The gravel crunched under his boots as he made his way to his patrol car, Emily's voice still reverberating in his mind. Keep doing the work. He unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat, the familiar scent of leather and coffee grounds enveloping him. For years, he'd worn his badge like a shield, a symbol of authority that justified every choice, every shortcut. But now, he saw it for what it was: a responsibility, a call to something greater. Justice wasn't just a lofty ideal, it was a reckoning, a mirror held up to those who dared to abuse their power. And the consequences, they weren't just for the guilty, they were a warning to everyone, a lesson carved into the fabric of the community he served. James turned the key in the ignition, the engine rumbling to life beneath him. As he pulled out of the lot, the road stretching dark and quiet before him, he felt a quiet certainty take root. He wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, and the path ahead would be grueling. But for the first time in years, he believed he was finally walking it step by painstaking step toward something right.